They said an alpha never kneels. They lied. Because the night Vaelor Draven stood outside his own throne room and heard another man's laughter echo through walls he built with blood. He didn't rage. He didn't draw steel. He just stood there in the dark corridor of everything he'd conquered and felt the specific cold of a man who finally understands that the empire he ruled so perfectly never once included the one person who made it worth ruling. This is the story of what happens after the crown stops protecting you. Stay until the end. Like this, if betrayal ever taught you something, power couldn't. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. What? The first thing the servants noticed was the silence, not the absence of noise. Ashthorn Palace was never truly quiet, not with 600 souls moving through its obsidian corridors at any given hour, not with the furnaces running their midnight rotation in the underbelly of the East Wing, not with the garrison changing watch on the silver bridges every 4 hours like clockwork bolted into the Empire's heartbeat. No. What the servants noticed was a different kind of silence, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses against your chest when you walk through a room and understand, without anyone telling you, that something enormous has shifted in the architecture of the world you thought you knew. Varethia, the head chambermaid of the upper residential wing, found the Queen's quarters empty at 6 in the morning on the 14th day of winter. She told this story 17 times in the years that followed, and every time she told it, she started with the same detail. The candles had been extinguished, not burned down, not snuffed by draft, extinguished deliberately, one, by a woman who intended to leave no light behind for anyone else to follow. The writing desk held a single folded note. Bretta didn't read it. She was not a woman who read royal correspondence, not because she lacked the education, but because 31 years of palace service had taught her that the contents of such notes carried a specific gravity, the kind that crushed the people closest to them. She sent immediately for the head steward. The head steward sent for the chamberlain. The chamberlain stood in the doorway of the Queen's empty chambers for a full 90 seconds without moving, then turned and walked with unusual purpose toward the King's private study, where Vaelor Draven was already awake and had been awake, by all accounts, since before midnight. He was standing at the northern window when the chamberlain entered. This was unusual. Vaelor Draven did not stand at windows. He sat at tables, stood at maps, moved through rooms with the contained efficiency of a man who understood that every action in a palace was also a performance. Windows were for people who needed comfort from landscapes. The king had never appeared to need comfort from anything. Your Majesty. The chamberlain's voice was the specific flatness of a man delivering information he wishes was not his to deliver. The Queen's chambers. I know, Vaelor said. The chamberlain paused. The note. I know about the note. Another pause. Longer this time. Shall I summon the council? Vaelor didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, Ashthorn's pre-dawn cityscape spread below him like a painting of everything he owned. The iron bridges lit with gas flame torches, the market district's dark geometry, the outer wall running its perimeter against the winter sky, and beyond it, the roads that led in 7 directions into 7 provinces, every one of which he had either inherited through blood or taken through force by the time he was 32 years old. At the 8th bell, he said finally. Not before. Yes, Majesty. And Aldrich. Vaelor turned from the window for the first time. The chamberlain was a large man who had survived 4 decades of palace politics by mastering the art of looking carefully without appearing to look at all. What he saw in Vaelor's face in that moment was something he also told people about for years afterward, though he chose his audience carefully for that particular story. No one is to speak to the garrison about the Queen's absence until I have addressed the council. That order comes directly from me and supersedes anything anyone else might instruct them. Understood, Majesty. And send someone to verify whether Lord Castan Aldmere arrived at the southern guest hall last night as scheduled. The chamberlain's expression did not change. He was too experienced for that, but something moved behind his eyes. The brief, involuntary flicker of a man connecting a thread he hadn't expected to find in this room at this hour. Of course, Majesty. He left. Vaelor turned back to the window. The note was already in his hand. He had been holding it since before the chamberlain arrived. He didn't need to read it again. He had read it 4 times in the space of 2 minutes when he found it. in the hour before dawn, when he had gone to the Queen's chambers for the first time in 11 days. Not out of guilt, he had told himself, but because there were provincial ledgers that required her signature. A convenience of administrative necessity that he had gotten very good at constructing as reason for interaction when the real reasons had become too uncomfortable to examine. The note said one word: enough. He knew her handwriting the way he knew the seal of every noble house in the empire, not with warmth, but with the specific catalogued recognition of things that carried consequences. Seris Valhart had beautiful handwriting, not ornamental, precise. The letters carried the same quality as her work: economical, deliberate, stripped of anything that served no functional purpose. He had admired it once, years ago, before admiration had been replaced by assumption. Enough. One word was a particular kind of condemnation. It didn't argue. It didn't list grievances or make demands or appeal to anything he might have offered in response. One word closed a door from the other side and took the handle with it. A man who had spent 20 years of his life making things yield to his will had no mechanism for a door like that. He folded the note and put it in the interior pocket of his coat. He was still wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before. This was also unusual. The council convened at the 8th bell in the lower war chamber, not the ceremonial hall. Vaelor had chosen the location deliberately. The ceremonial hall had windows on 3 sides and an acoustic design that had been used for 3 centuries to project royal authority outward into the palace's physical spaces. The war chamber was windowless stone, a room built for information rather than impression. If there was going to be a conversation about what had happened, he intended it to happen in a room that did not amplify panic into architecture. 7 men sat at the long iron table. Grand Advocate Mersenne Kral, who handled the legal mechanisms of the crown with the unsentimental efficiency of a man who had long since made peace with the difference between law and justice. General Aldous Reveth, first commander of the imperial garrison, a man who had served Vaelor for 16 years and still addressed him with the particular mixture of respect and directness that came from having watched someone become who they were. Treasury Master Doric Fenn, who looked perpetually aggrieved by the existence of anything that complicated his ledgers. And 4 others, various portfolios of governance, all of whom watched Vaelor enter the room with expressions carefully calibrated to show concern without presuming to understand what they were concerned about. Vaelor sat. He did not move with any visible urgency. He placed his hands flat on the table's surface, looked at each face in the room for exactly the amount of time required to establish that he was in command of this meeting, and then said, "The Queen has left the palace." The silence that followed this statement was the kind that happens when every person in a room has already heard something and is waiting to see how the official version compares to the corridor version. General Reveth was the one who spoke first. He generally was. Left voluntarily? Yes. Do we know her direction? Not yet. Then we have a security concern before we have anything else. Reveth's voice was the flat, practical tone of a man for whom problems resolved more cleanly when sorted by category. If the Queen's location is unknown, the potential for her to be used as leverage by— "She left willingly," Vaelor said. "She is not in danger." "With respect, Majesty, we can't confirm that without knowing—" "She left a note." He said it without inflection. "She is not in danger." Another silence. This one had a different texture. The 7 men at the table had been in power long enough to understand that certain truths lived inside the spaces between what was said and what was explained. It was Kral who navigated it first, with the careful precision of a man stepping across ice of uncertain thickness. In terms of legal standing, if the Queen has voluntarily departed the palace and the Crown's protection, there are provisions in the Alpha Covenant law that— "I'm aware of the provisions," Vaelor said. "The Council will need to address public communication. The Queen's absence will be noted by— I know what will be noted." He looked at Kral directly. The advocate was a man of 60 who had weathered royal volatility across 2 reigns. He met the look without flinching, which was one of the qualities Vaelor had always found useful in him. "What I need from this council in this meeting is practical information, not procedural reminders." Kral nodded once, conceding the point without abandoning it. "Where is Lord Castan Aldmere?" Vaelor asked. He directed the question at no one in particular, which meant it was directed at everyone. The room's quality changed again. It was barely perceptible, the kind of change you could only read if you had spent years watching people manage the weight of what they knew and what they were permitted to acknowledge knowing. Treasury Master Fen cleared his throat. Lord Aldmere departed for his southern estate before dawn, Majesty. His steward confirmed the departure. Before dawn. Yes. Was he scheduled to depart before dawn? A pause. He was scheduled to depart at midday. Vaelor did not respond to this immediately. He looked at the wall above Fen's head for a moment with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. Reveth, who was watching his king with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read weather in a person's face, said, Majesty, is there something specific the council should understand about the circumstances of the Queen's departure? It was the most direct question anyone had asked. It was also the most honest, which was why Reveth had asked it and not one of the others. Vaelor looked at him. No, he said. There is nothing the council needs to understand beyond the fact that the Queen has departed and that we will address it through proper channels. And what channels are those? I'll advise you when I've determined them. He moved to stand, which was the signal that a meeting had concluded. Track her route. Quietly. No garrison involvement, no official inquiry, no dispatch of any kind that leaves a formal record. I want to know where she is, not where she's been. The men stood. The meeting disbanded with the specific efficiency of people who had understood more than they had been told and were too seasoned to say so. Reveth caught Vaelor's arm as he reached the door. Not a grab, a touch, the kind of thing only 16 years of shared history made permissible. Vaelor. The king stopped. He didn't turn immediately. I've known you to make 4 decisions in my time that you regretted afterward, Reveth said quietly. I'm asking you to be careful about making a 5th. I'm always careful. You're always controlled. That's not the same thing. Vaelor turned then. Something moved in his expression that none of the other 6 men in the room would have recognized. A brief, unguarded thing, the face of someone who is tired in a way that cannot be resolved by sleep. Then it was gone. Track the route, he said. 2 men, no uniforms. He walked out. The corridor beyond the war chamber was empty and cold. He moved through it with the same contained efficiency as always, nodding once at the pair of guards stationed at the junction that led back toward the residential wing, and walked the long way around the palace's interior to avoid passing through the hall, where he would have to interact with anyone who hadn't yet been briefed on how to look at him this morning. He did not go back to the window. He went to his strategy room, where the provincial maps were spread across 3 separate tables in various stages of annotation. And he stood there in the middle of those maps for a long time, surrounded by the visual evidence of everything he had built and held and defended. And he was aware, with a clarity that was somehow worse than any emotion, that somewhere in the 12 hours since midnight, his wife had packed a physician's case and disappeared into the Empire with a single word of explanation, and that he had known, even before the chamberlain came to his door, that she was gone. He had known because he had stood outside the Western Strategy Chamber the night before, at a time when he should not have been there, and the door had been half open, and Nysera's voice had carried the specific, comfortable laughter of a woman who feels no need to be careful. And he had heard himself speak, had heard his own words, delivered in the casual register of a man discussing an asset whose loyalty he had already processed and filed. And even then, hearing himself, some part of him had understood what those words would cost. She will remain loyal. She always does. He stood in the middle of his maps and he let himself hear it again. She always does. The specific brutality of that sentence was not in the words themselves. It was in the tense, present perfect habit, the grammatical structure of something you don't think about anymore because it has become reliable. Like weather patterns in a province you know well. Like the water rights of a river you have been taxing for 20 years. He had reduced her to a certainty, and somewhere between the moment of hearing it and the moment of finding her note, he had managed to construct a version of the night in which she would not have heard him, in which the corridor acoustics would have swallowed the words before they reached the door, because it had been easier to build that version than to sit with what actually happened. He had known. He had chosen, for 12 hours, to know it differently. Now there was one word on a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket, and there were no other versions left to build. He sat down at the edge of the strategy table, in the chair that put his back to the door, something he virtually never did, a position that every instinct cultivated by 20 years of political survival told him was wrong. And he stayed very still. And he thought about Seris Vaelor in a way he had not permitted himself to think about her in a long time. Not about her function, not about the way she moved through the machinery of his court, not about her administrative precision or the way the elder alliances had softened after she began attending provincial delegations. He thought about the version of her he had first encountered at the Vaelor estate 17 years ago, when he had come as a king making a strategic alliance and found himself standing in a medicinal garden at dusk, watching a 23-year-old woman argue with a scholar 3 times her age about the fever treatment protocols in the southern mining settlements, and winning the argument with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who knows not just that they are right, but why they are right, and what it costs when wrong people hold authority over things they don't understand. He had loved her for that. He had genuinely, specifically, irreducibly loved her for exactly that quality. And then, over the years, he had loved the idea that she had it. The way a man keeps a rare book on a shelf he never opens because the knowledge of its presence is enough. Because what he actually needs is the appearance of someone in his life who carries that quality. And what he cannot afford is the active engagement with what it actually demands. He had turned her into a decoration of his own better instincts. Vaelor was not a man given to this kind of self-examination. He was constitutionally unsuited to it, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his form of intelligence had always been outward-facing, strategic, calibrated to external reality. The internal accounting of motive and meaning had always struck him, in his private moments, as the kind of indulgence that softened men until they could no longer make the hard calls that kept kingdoms intact. But sitting in a windowless room surrounded by the cartography of his empire, with her handwriting burning a single syllable through his coat and into his chest, he found that the external world had temporarily lost its traction. There was nothing to maneuver, nothing to optimize. There was only the specific weight of having been the instrument of your own loss, and the colder weight of having heard the truth about it 12 hours ago and chosen, because convenience and pride had been available as alternatives, to not yet accept it. He stood up. He was not going to do this here. He was the king of Varethia. He had 7 provinces and a standing army, and a legal apparatus that had compelled the compliance of things considerably more resistant than one absent queen. He went to find Crowell. 3 weeks later, the first official dispatch arrived in Hollowmere. Seris Vaelor had not been difficult to locate. She had not tried to be difficult to locate. She had traveled north through the Myrethane passes with a single pack and a physician's case, stopping twice to treat illness at way stations, stopping openly, using her name, leaving documentation with local record keepers, and arrived in the Hollowmere territory at the start of the 2nd week. She had found the abandoned healing sanctuary on the eastern edge of the settlement, not through any palace resource, but through asking the people she met on the road, which was how she had always found things. The sanctuary had not been used for 6 years. Its previous occupant, a healer named Arvin Doss, had died of the same lung condition he had spent 2 decades treating in the miners he served, which was the particular cruelty that medical work in the Northern Territories often came with. The building was stone and timber, 2 floors, south-facing windows to maximize the short winter light, a storage cellar that still held dry goods preserved by the cold, and a herb garden in the back that had gone wild, but was recognizably organized beneath the wildness by someone who had once known what they were doing. She lit a fire the first night and sat beside it with her mother's journals and did not cry. This was not because she did not feel anything. It was because she had already done the crying in the 3 days between the corridor and the departure, alone in her chambers while the palace continued its operations around her with the magnificent indifference of machinery that doesn't require any individual component's happiness to function. By the time she packed her case and extinguished the candles, she had used up what the grief required in its first form. What was left was something harder and more useful, a kind of cold that was not numbness, but clarity. The first patient came on the 5th day, a miner named Auric, with 2 broken ribs and a suspicion of the deeper lung damage that came from years of iron dust, referred by his wife who had heard from a woman at the market that someone had moved into the old Doss sanctuary and was practicing medicine. He knocked on the door at mid-morning with his hat in his hands and an expression that combined pain with the particular wariness of people who had learned not to expect things from official channels. "I heard someone was working here again," he said. I'm working here again, Seris said. Come in. She was not what he had expected. He told his wife this afterward, though he couldn't entirely articulate why. Something about the way she moved through the space, with the precise, unhurried economy of a person who has never needed a room to confirm their presence in it. She examined him thoroughly. She asked questions not just about the ribs, but about his history, his breathing patterns over the past 2 years, what season the cough got worse in, and whether it had changed character in the last 6 months. The ribs will heal, she told him, applying the binding with practiced hands. This, she pressed carefully at the base of his lung on the left side, watching his face, is what I want to monitor. Come back in 10 days, and tell me whether you've been able to get any rotation in your work assignments or whether the management has been keeping you on the deep face. Auric blinked at her. No one had asked him about management rotation before. They keep us where we're productive, he said. Yes, she said without particular inflection, but in the tone of someone filing information they plan to address later. Tell me who to contact there. You're going to talk to mine management? About occupational health practices in confined extraction environments? Yes. She tied off the binding and helped him with his shirt. They generally respond better when spoken to before the provincial health inspector gets involved. Consider it a courtesy. He stared at her. Then slowly, the wariness in his face shifted into something else. Not surprise exactly, more like a man recalibrating toward something he had stopped expecting from people in positions of knowledge. What do I owe you? He asked. Nothing today. Pay me when you can, what you can. I'll tell you if I ever need it to be more than that. She was building the Ember House in the literal sense by the second week, repairing the storage shelves, clearing the herb garden, cataloging what the previous occupant had left against her own supplies, organizing the examination space with the methodical attention to workflow that she had developed over 12 years of working inside a palace medical system that had been designed for ceremony rather than function. The palace had always had resources and almost no sense of how to use them. Hollowmere had almost no resources and a population that had learned out of necessity exactly what mattered. She worked 14-hour days. She ate simple food and slept hard, and woke before dawn to write in her journals by firelight before the first patients arrived. The work was not comfortable, but comfort was not what she was here for. She was here because the work was real. Because a miner with damaged lungs was a problem with a biological mechanism and a social context, and a series of interventions that either helped or didn't help. And the feedback on her competence arrived not through political approval, but through whether the person in front of her could breathe better next month than they could this month. There was a brutal honesty in that feedback loop that the palace had never offered her. In Ashthorn, she had been competent in a system that didn't require her competence in order to function. In Hollowmere, she was competent in a system that was waiting for exactly what she had. The first dispatch arrived in the 21st day. She was washing instruments when Tomas, the settlement's informal courier, 14 years old, quick-eyed, constitutionally incapable of delivering information without editorializing about it, arrived at the Ember House door with a sealed envelope that bore the black wax of Ashthorn Palace. That's a crown seal, Tomas said, looking at it with the expression of someone who has recognized a venomous snake. That's from the capital. I can see that, Seris said. She dried her hands and took it. Are you in trouble? Probably. She looked at the seal for a moment with no expression. Thank you, Tomas. He lingered. She looked at him. Right, he said, and left. She opened the letter at her work table. It was from Grand Advocate Merson Crowell, written in the formal register of legal correspondence, which meant it was dense with procedural language that required reading twice to resolve into its actual content. The actual content was this. The Crown, exercising authority under the Alpha Covenant, was initiating a formal inquiry into the circumstances of the Queen's departure, including potential examination of the disposal of property, the unauthorized appropriation of medical materials from the royal household, and the breach of bonding covenant provisions pertaining to the obligated residence of the Alpha's consort within designated palace precincts. She put the letter down on the table. She sat with it for a long time. Not because she was frightened. She had known something like this would come. Had factored it into the planning with the same calm that she factored everything she could anticipate. The Crown had resources, and she had left those resources behind, which had been a choice she made with open eyes. The charges were not unexpected. What she sat with was something more specific than the charges. She had known Vaelor Draven for 17 years. She had been bonded to him for 12. She had watched him navigate wars and succession crises, and a famine in the eastern provinces, and 3 assassination attempts with a specific cold-blooded efficiency that she had always recognized as his truest nature. Not cruelty, not even ruthlessness exactly, but the capacity to identify what a situation required and move toward it without letting sentiment alter his trajectory. She had once respected that capacity. She had eventually come to understand that it did not discriminate between enemies and people. He had applied it to her. The charges were not passion or rage or grief. They were the mechanism of a man who had been made to feel loss and had reached, with the same cold efficiency that had always defined him, for the tools available. He was not furious, probably. He was managing. He was doing what he always did when something resisted his control. He was bringing force to bear on it. "Of course," she said to the empty room. Then she picked up a pen and wrote a letter to Cedric Thornvale. Thornvale arrived at Hollowmere 18 days later, having traveled north with none of the staff or carriage appointments that had made him a recognizable figure in every capital city in the Empire's legal circuit. He arrived on a rented horse with 2 saddlebags, and the expression of a man who had read all the correspondence and had opinions about it that he was professionally obligated to contain until he had heard from his client directly. He was 61 years old, compact, with the precise physical economy of a man who had spent 4 decades winning arguments by being the person in the room who had prepared more thoroughly than anyone else. His eyes had the quality of instruments, not cold, not calculating, but functional. He used them to look at things accurately, which was a different quality than looking at things kindly and ultimately more useful in the context where he operated. He sat at the Ember House workroom table with a cup of the bitter pine tea that was apparently what this territory offered as hospitality, and read through the documents Seris had assembled in the 18 days since the first Crown dispatch. "You've been thorough," he said. "I've had time." "And you anticipated the property claim?" "I anticipated all of it." Thornvale glanced at her over the papers. "The covenant breach provision is the one they'll press hardest. It's the cleanest charge, legally. A bonded consort leaving designated palace residence is textbook covenant violation under Alpha law." "It is," Seris agreed, "unless the departure is in response to conditions that themselves constitute a covenant violation." A pause. Thornvale's eyes went to her in the way of a man hearing something precise and testing its precision. "You'd have to establish what those conditions were, and that's a public proceeding." "I know. You would be testifying under formal inquiry about the circumstances of your departure from the palace. That testimony is on record. It becomes part of the public legal archive. It can be read, cited, referenced." "I know what a public proceeding is, Cedric." Another pause. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite assessment because he had already assessed her, and what he was doing now was something different. The particular attention of a man who has heard a plan he respects and is taking its full measure. "You're not trying to defend against the charges," he said. "No. You're going to make the proceeding itself the argument. I'm going to let the evidence speak," she said, "in a room with witnesses." Thornvale set down his tea. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Hollowmere wind moved through the settlement with its characteristic low, continuous pressure, the sound of geography that didn't apologize for its own severity. "What happened?" he asked. Not in the legal register, just asking. Seris looked at the space above the table for a moment, and then told him. Not as testimony. She had not yet rehearsed it as testimony, but as the plain, unornamented facts of what had accumulated over 12 years, and what had ended at a half-open door at midnight in a corridor she should not have been walking at that hour. When she finished, Thornvale was quiet for a long time. "He knew you'd heard," he said. "Before the note. He knew." "Yes." "And filed the charges anyway." "Yes." Thornvale picked up his tea again, looked at it, set it back down. "All right," he said. "Then we'll need to go back further than the night in the corridor. The tribunal will want precedent, 12 years of it." He opened a fresh journal to the first page. "Let's start from the beginning, not the marriage, before that. What you were before you were his queen. And in Ashthorn Palace, 300 miles south, In the chamber that had once been Vaelor Draven's greatest strategic command, a general stood before his king and delivered the news he had been assembling for 30 days with the specific expression of a soldier who understands that there are battles his weapons are not designed for. "She's hired Thornvale," Reveth said. Something moved in Vaelor's face, a brief, involuntary thing. "He's been in Hollowmere for 2 weeks," Reveth continued. "He didn't come with a staff, he came alone. He's been there working every day. His last 3 cases before a tribunal, Majesty. All 3 were crown actions. All 3, I know his record." "Then you know that he doesn't take cases he doesn't expect to win." Vaelor was silent. "The council is asking me to advise them on how to frame the public communication going forward," Reveth said. "They want to know whether we're going to tribunal." "We are." Reveth was still for a moment. "Majesty, Kral's assessment of the Covenant breach charge is that it's technically sound, but contextually, I know Kral's assessment." "Then you know that a tribunal isn't—" "What I know," Vaelor said, with the very specific control of a man who is maintaining something at considerable cost, "is that I am the Alpha Sovereign of the Black Crest Dominion, and that what occurred in this palace does not become the business of public record because my wife decided to—" He stopped. The word wife had come out of his mouth with a kind of weight that hadn't been there a month ago. A month ago it had been a category, a function, something with clear legal parameters and administrative implications. Now it was a wound. Reveth waited. "Continue with the tribunal," Vaelor said. "Yes, Majesty. And find out what Thornvale's strategy is. Not through official channels. Find me someone in his professional circle who knows how he builds a case. That might be difficult. Thornvale is—" "Everyone has a circle, Aldous. Find it." Reveth looked at him with the 16-year look, the one that said more than what his mouth was going to say next. "Is there anything else?" "No." Reveth moved toward the door. Then, without turning, he said, "Do you know what she left behind?" Vaelor didn't answer. "All of it," Reveth said. "The jewelry, the ceremonial seals, the crown accounts. She took her physician instruments and her mother's journals. Everything else is still in her chambers." He paused. "I mention it because it's a legal detail that Thornvale will certainly raise, not because I think you need to hear it." He turned slightly. "Though perhaps you do." He left. Vaelor sat alone in the strategy room for a very long time. That evening, a letter arrived bearing the personal seal of Dowager Queen Vaelor Draven from her estate at Meyerwatch. He did not open it for 4 hours. When he finally did, he read it in the same windowless chamber where he had heard the first report of Seris's departure, alone, with no lamp lit, by the failing light of winter afternoon. His mother had never been a woman who performed emotion. She had navigated his father's kingdom with the same precision that Seris had navigated the quiet, load-bearing work of a woman whose competence existed entirely in the spaces that official records didn't capture. She had been, he realized reading this letter, more honest with him at 68 than she had ever been permitted to be at the age when it might have changed something. The letter was long. It told him things he had never been told, not because they hadn't been true, but because the architecture of what had been his family had been designed, like most imperial architectures, around the function of the structure rather than the health of the people inside it. He read one paragraph 3 times. "You were raised to believe that loyalty given freely and loyalty compelled by circumstance were indistinguishable from each other because your father needed both to look the same in order to function. I let that teaching stand because I did not have the courage, or perhaps the selfishness, to dismantle what he was building while still living inside it. That was my failure, not yours. But it became yours when you carried it forward. And I cannot watch you use the machinery of this empire to compel something that was already being given to you and say nothing. She will not come back because you force her. If she comes back at all, it will be because you become something capable of being returned to. You learned power from watching silence wear a crown. Now you have the chance to learn something harder. I do not know if you will take it. Your mother's love for you is not conditional on whether you do. But your future is." He folded the letter. He sat in the dark with it for a long time. And in the morning, he did not withdraw the tribunal charges. Because there are 2 kinds of knowledge. The knowledge that arrives in your mind as truth, and the knowledge that you have lived through your body long enough to act on. And Vaelor Draven, At 44 years old, with 17 years of a relationship reduced to one word on folded paper in his coat pocket, had the first kind and not yet the second. He sent the dispatch confirming the tribunal date. He appointed Crowell as lead advocate. And 3 days before the tribunal was scheduled to convene in the citadel of Morningstone, a writer arrived from Hollowmere with a response that Thornvale had filed through official legal channels. A document so precisely constructed, so surgically positioned against every charge the Crown had raised, that Crowell brought it to the War Chamber himself and set it on the table in front of Vaelor with the expression of a man who has just examined an opposing fortification and revised his estimate of what taking it was going to cost. "He's not going to argue the covenant breach on technicalities," Crowell said. "He's going to argue it on precedent. Specifically," he pointed to the third page, "he's citing 12 years of documented practice to establish that the Queen's medical work predated the bonding and was never formally incorporated into the Crown's property, which means the equipment and materials she removed were hers before they were royal and therefore cannot be misappropriated." "That's legally precise," Crowell said. "Yes, and that's before we get to the testimony." "What testimony?" "She's going to testify," Crowell said. "In full. Under formal inquiry. She's not just responding to the charges, Majesty. She's using the proceeding as an opportunity to—" He paused, choosing the word carefully, "document." Vaelor went very still. "Everything," Crowell said. 12 years. She has records. I've seen the evidence list." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing this for 40 years. I have never seen an evidence list like this one." Another pause. "She was always watching. She wrote everything down." He looked at his king with the expression of a man who is not able to say what he is actually thinking, but can at least make certain that what he is not saying is heard. Everything. Outside the window, the winter of Ashthorn was settling into its deepest register. The empire moved through its ordinary rhythms, markets and garrison rotations, and provincial dispatches, and the 1,000 daily mechanisms of a dominion that ran on power and fear and the performance of inevitable order. And in a small stone building in the northernmost territory of that empire, a woman was standing at her work table in the pre-dawn dark, finishing her preparation notes for the tribunal by firelight, and the fire threw her shadow long across the wall behind her. Not the shadow of a queen, not the shadow of a fugitive or a defendant or a woman in any recognized legal category, but the shadow of someone who had, after 12 years of constructing herself around the requirements of another person's world, finally recovered her own outline. She sealed the last document. She set it with the others. She went to the window and looked out at the Hollowmere dark, at the settlement sleeping under winter stars, at the frozen marshland beyond it stretching toward the mountains, at the empire she had left and the world she had built in the space where it ended. Then a knock at the door. At this hour it was always urgent. She opened it. The rider on her step was not Tomas. He was not anyone she recognized. He was travel-stained and breathing hard, carrying the dust of a road covered too fast, and he bore no house seal and no crown insignia, and he held his hat in front of him with both hands in the particular stance of a man who has been instructed to deliver something and is not certain how it will be received. "Healer Vaelhart," he said. "Yes, I was sent by—" He stopped. He looked at her. He seemed in the way of a man who has been carrying information for 3 days and now has to convert it into words, to be deciding how to begin. "There's a woman, 4 hours south, at the Mirathane Crossroad way station. She asked me to find you specifically. She said you would know her name, and she said—" He paused. "She said to tell you that silence wears a crown, but she's done wearing it. And she wanted to speak to the person who understood what that cost before anyone else in this empire had the chance to frame it differently." Ipong. Seris went very still. She knew only one person who would use that particular construction. "What is her condition?" she asked. The writer looked at her with the expression of someone about to say something that changes the shape of everything. "She is unwell," he said. "She has been for some time. She said the timing was not accidental. She said—" He stopped again, swallowed. "She said she needed to speak to you before the tribunal. She said what she has to tell you will change what you decide to do in that chamber, and that her son doesn't know she's here." The fire behind Seris threw its long, steady light. The winter dark beyond the doorway was absolute. She already knew who was at the Mirathane Crossroad. and she already understood with the specific cold intelligence that had always been her most reliable faculty that what was waiting for her 4 hours south was not just a dying woman's confession. It was the one piece of the story she had never had access to. The piece that had made Vaelor Draven into the man she had loved, and the man she had lost, and possibly, the man who might, under different circumstances, have been capable of becoming someone else entirely. She pulled her coat from the hook. She picked up her physician case. "Show me the road," she said. The road to Mirathane Crossroad was 4 hours through frozen dark, and Seris made it in 3.5. She did not push the horse out of recklessness. She pushed it because she had spent 12 years learning to read the difference between urgency that could wait and urgency that could not, and everything about the rider's face, the specific quality of his restraint, the way he had chosen each word with the care of a man who understood that some information changes the recipient permanently, had told her that the second category was what she was riding toward. The way station at Mirathane Crossroad was not a place designed for anything except transitional necessity. It was a low stone building at the junction of 3 provincial roads, staffed by a rotating pair of imperial relay men, with a common room that held 8 beds and a hearth large enough to matter, and nothing else of note. Travelers stopped there because they had to, not because they wanted to. It was the kind of place that existed at the edges of empire. Functional, unglamorous, entirely honest in its purpose. There was a single lamp burning in the east-facing window when Seris arrived. The relay man who opened the door was young and looked like he had not slept and had opinions about that. But one look at Seris and her physician case resolved whatever question he had been preparing, and he simply stepped aside and pointed to the room at the back of the building. "She wouldn't let me send for anyone else," he said. "She said she'd traveled this far on her own terms, and she'd wait on her own terms. How long has she been here?" 2 days? Seris paused at that. 2 days was not an illness that had ambushed someone on the road. 2 days at a way station meant you had arrived here deliberately and were waiting for something specific. She had come here to wait for the healer who understood what silence cost. She knocked once and opened the door. Dowager Queen Vaelor Draven was 68 years old and had the physical presence of a woman who had been formidable at 40 and had not permitted age to renegotiate that entirely. She was sitting upright in the single chair the room offered, wrapped in a traveling coat that was good quality but not royal, the coat of a woman who had made a deliberate choice about what she was going to look like on this particular journey. Her hair was silver and pulled back with the severe practicality of someone who had stopped caring about ornamentation at some point and never resumed. Her eyes, when they found Seris in the doorway, were the same specific gray as Vaelor's, and they carried the same quality. Not cold, not warm, but precise. Instruments, trained to see accurately. She was also clearly ill. Not acutely, not in the way of a crisis that had ambushed her in transit. In the way of something that had been progressing for some time and had now reached the stage where concealment required more energy than she was willing to spend on it. "You came faster than I expected," Vaelor said. "You said the timing wasn't accidental." Seris set her case on the table and moved to her patient without preamble. "How long?" "Sit down first." "I'll sit down after I know what I'm dealing with." The older woman looked at her for a moment with something that might, in a different context, have been the beginning of a smile. "Vaelor said you never wasted ceremony when there was work to be done." "Vaelor talked about me." More than he knew he was. Elira watched Seris's hands as she began a preliminary examination with the unhurried competence of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. "He described you once, years ago, when I asked him directly. He said you were the most efficient person he had ever worked beside. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give." "I know," Seris said. "That was also part of the problem." She examined in silence for several minutes. Elira submitted to it with the patience of someone who has already made a private reckoning with what the findings would be and is no longer concerned with the verdict, only the conversation that needs to happen before everything else proceeds. "Lung?" Seris said finally. It was not a question. "For about 14 months. You've been treating it." "I've been managing it. There's a physician in Mirewatch who has been very conscientious. He doesn't know I'm here." A pause. "Vaelor doesn't know I'm here. No one does, except the boy I sent to find you." Seris sat down in the second chair and looked at the woman in front of her with the same direct attention she gave everything. No softness, no performance of softness, but genuine engagement with what was actually here. Why me? There are better equipped facilities in the capital. Because I didn't come here for facilities. Elira met her gaze without difficulty. I came here because I wrote my son a letter 3 weeks ago, and I'm not certain it accomplished what I intended it to accomplish. And because the tribunal is in 3 days, and because I am the only person alive who understands completely why Vaelor Draven does what he does. And I have spent 40 years not saying so out loud, and I am done with that. The fire in the small room spoke in its low, continuous voice. What do you want to tell me? Seris asked. What Elira told her took 2 hours. She did not tell it linearly. She told it the way people tell the truths they have been carrying the longest, in pieces, orbiting the center, approaching from different angles each time, as though the act of telling itself was a kind of recalibration. A woman restoring the correct weight in proportion to a story that had been compressed by years of necessary silence into something it was never supposed to be. She told Seris about King Vaelor Draven, who had been Vaelor's father and her husband for 31 years. Not the version of Malrek in the official histories, the conqueror, the territorial administrator, the architect of 3 of the 7 provincial annexations that now formed Vaelor's empire. She told the version that official histories were not designed to hold, the version that was constituted of 1,000 small encounters in private rooms over 3 decades, the specific grammar of a man who understood that the most comprehensive form of control was the kind that looked from the outside like stability. She told it without bitterness. This was the thing that struck Seris most forcefully, not the content, though the content was sufficient, but the affect with which it was delivered. Elira Draven told this story the way Seris wrote case notes, with the precision of someone who had had a very long time to achieve accurate description and had decided at last that accuracy mattered more than protection. He never struck me, Elira said. I want to be clear about that because the assumption people make when I describe what 30 years looked like is that they're listening for a particular kind of damage. The damage was different. It was quieter. She looked at the fire for a moment. He was very good at constructing a world in which my judgment was always slightly wrong. Not demonstrably wrong, just wrong enough to require his correction. After 20 years of that, I had stopped trusting my own assessment of almost anything. A pause. Vaelor watched all of this. He was a child and then a young man watching all of this. He watched his father manage everything and everyone in our household with absolute unhurried certainty. He watched what happened to the people who tried to operate outside that certainty. And he watched me. He watched me negotiate survival inside a structure that had been specifically designed so that survival required compliance. He thought you were content, Seris said. He thought I had chosen it, which is worse. Elira's eyes came back to her. He thought a woman of my intelligence, watching everything she watched, could not have been living as she was living unless she had determined that the arrangement was acceptable. He did not have a framework for what it looked like when intelligent women make accommodations that have nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with the absence of alternatives. Seris was quiet for a moment. So he learned that love looks like that. He learned that a bonded household operates like that the person with authority manages and the person without it adapts, and that this is not dysfunction. It is simply the natural order of how things work, when one person holds the crown and the other holds everything the crown rests on without being credited for the weight. She stopped. She was managing her breathing with the careful economy of someone who has learned to ration effort, and Seris watched this without comment, because this was not the moment to redirect toward medicine. The letter I sent him, Elira continued after a moment. I told him some of this, not all of it. I thought partial truth might be enough to shift something, to create enough uncertainty about what he was doing that he would stop. She looked at Seris directly. It didn't work, did it? He filed the tribunal charges after receiving it. Elira closed her eyes briefly. Yes, of course he did. She opened them again. Because knowing the truth of a thing and being capable of acting from that truth are 2 different mechanisms in a person. And Vaelor has always had the first without the second when the knowledge required him to surrender something. His father was the same way. They were both men who could see very clearly once they had been shown, and who then required an extraordinary amount of additional pressure before that clarity translated into behavior. What kind of additional pressure? Seris said. This was not a naive question. She asked it the way she asked about dosage, precisely, because she needed to understand the mechanism. Illyra looked at her for a long time. The kind that comes from inside, she said. Malric never changed because nothing external ever made the cost high enough. He was the most powerful man in his world. The cost of his behavior was always distributed outward, onto me, onto others, never back onto him in a way that he could not buffer with that power. She paused. Vaelor has already paid a cost that Malric never paid. He has already lost something that cannot be recovered by decree. He knows what he did. He's known for weeks. The question is not whether he understands the failure. She looked at the fire again. The question is whether the understanding will arrive before pride does enough more damage that understanding becomes useless. Seris sat with this in the silence that the room offered. There is a particular kind of education that can only be received in a specific kind of moment, not in libraries, not in strategy chambers, not in the formal architecture of learning as it is usually constructed. It arrives in a low-lit room at midnight, delivered by a woman who has worn the weight of an unspoken truth for 40 years, and has finally, in the last portion of her life, decided that the truth is more important than the silence that protected her. And what it teaches you is not new information exactly. It is rather the final correct frame for information you already had, and the effect of that correct frame is that you see the picture differently, not as something that happened to you, as something that was made by a sequence of choices, most of them comprehensible, some of them even sympathetic, all of them insufficient. Seris had known, on some level, the architecture of what Vaelor was, had known for years, had constructed understanding after understanding of it with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, and had also, for years, quietly chosen to maintain a version of hope that operated alongside that understanding in a kind of productive suspension, the hope that understanding correctly was the same as influencing outcome. It was not the same. Understanding why a fire burns does not make you less burned. "What do you want me to do with this?" Seris said. "At the tribunal." "I want you to tell the truth," Illyra said. "All of it. I want you to tell it clearly and without sparing anyone, including yourself. I want the record to exist, not because it will change Vaelor," she paused, "not immediately, but because truths spoken into official record have a permanence that private understanding does not. Because other women in other palaces will exist after you and after me. And the architecture that shaped Malric and then shaped Vaelor does not dismantle itself without documentation. That's a very long game, Seris said. I have been playing it for 40 years. The older woman's voice was steady. I'm asking you to play it for the next 3 days. They sat together in the way station room until the lamp had burned low and the fire had settled to coals, and Seris told Illyra what she planned to say in the tribunal chamber. Not all of it, but the shape of it, the architecture of an argument that Thornvale had helped her construct from 12 years of meticulous record-keeping. And that was, she thought, as close to a true account of what had happened as any formal proceeding was likely to permit. Illyra listened without interrupting. When Seris finished, the older woman said, "You still love him." It was not what Seris had expected. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking as a complication. I'm asking as a fact. Illyra's eyes were direct. You can love someone and still require them to be accountable. Those are not competing states. I know that. But you're managing it in your testimony. You're constructing the argument to avoid giving the appearance of personal investment because you know that personal investment can be used to frame the testimony as grievance rather than record. Illyra paused. That is smart. And it is also a form of the same compression you have been applying to yourself for 12 years. Seris looked at her. Tell it as it was, Illyra said. Including what you felt, including what you wanted. The grief is not a weakness in the record. It is the record. A woman who describes the loss of a genuine love with the same precision she describes the loss of administrative autonomy is harder to dismiss than either argument alone. Because one argument is legal and one is human, and when they are woven together accurately, there is no frame available to a tribunal that resolves into dismissal. There is only truth in the room, and truth in the room is the one thing that a system built on performed certainty cannot process without cracking. Seris left the way station before dawn. She did not push the horse on the return. She rode at a steady pace through the pre-dawn dark of the Hollowmere territory, through the frozen marshland and the iron-colored scrub of winter landscape, and she thought about what an older woman had given her in a low-lit room. Not strategy, not legal precedent, not the formal instruments of argument, a frame. The correct weight of the thing she was actually carrying. She had been preparing to make an argument. She arrived back at Ember House understanding that she was preparing to make a record. These were not the same thing, and the difference between them was the difference between winning and truth. And she had decided, somewhere on the dark road home, that she was no longer interested in the first at the expense of the second. Thornvale arrived at the Ember House at 7 in the morning with the evidence portfolio under one arm and the expression of a man who had been working since 5 and had opinions about the state of several things. "You were gone," he said. "I was." "Is there anything I need to know before we finalize the testimony structure?" She poured him tea and told him about Illyra. He was quiet for a long time when she finished. "She came to you specifically," he said. "Yes." "Before the tribunal?" "Yes." "Is she going to testify?" "She didn't say she would. She said she wanted the record to exist." Seris looked at him. "I'm going to change the testimony structure." Thornvale set down his cup. "Seris, not the legal arguments, those stay as they are. The personal testimony, I've been managing it to minimize the appearance of grievance. That was deliberate and correct strategy." "It was strategy," she said. "It wasn't entirely true. And I've decided that at this point, the truth of the full thing is more valuable than a strategically managed version of it." Thornvale looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has been practicing law for 40 years and has profound respect for truth and also profound respect for the gap between what truth deserves and what it reliably achieves in formal proceedings. "The legal arguments carry the case," he said carefully. "The personal testimony is context." "I know. If the personal testimony becomes more prominent than the legal structure. The legal structure is solid. You built it. It doesn't need me to hold it up." She met his eyes. "What it needs is for the room to understand what it's actually adjudicating. Not a property dispute, not a covenant technicality. The room needs to understand what was actually lost and why, and then decide whether the legal mechanisms of the Empire are going to be used to compel the return of something that was not property." He was quiet for a long time. "It's a risk," he said. "Yes. The tribunal is 3 crown-appointed judges. 2 of them have served under Vaelor for over a decade." "I know. If they determine that the personal testimony is Caedric," she said his name with the specific tone of a woman who has made a decision and is informing someone, not consulting them. "I have spent 12 years making careful strategic adjustments to myself in order to maintain an arrangement that someone else decided was acceptable. I'm done adjusting the testimony." He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. The tribunal convened on a morning of thin winter light that did very little to warm the interior of the citadel of Morningstone, which was called that because of the color of its walls, and which had earned the name with the specific fidelity of a building that had hosted enough concentrated human consequence to absorb some of its character. The chamber was formal but not large. Stone floor, 3 elevated judges' seats, a speaking floor, a gallery for the 60-odd witnesses and officials who were permitted to observe. The gallery was full. The gallery was always full for proceedings that involved the crown, but this one had drawn a particular quality of attention. The attention of people who understood that the outcome would set a precedent in a body of law that had not been challenged in 40 years, and that precedent had a way of echoing. Seris entered from the south door. She was wearing plain dark wool and carrying her physician case, which was not standard court attire and was entirely intentional. Thornvale had questioned this choice once, and she had explained it with 3 sentences, and he had not questioned it again. The gallery watched her walk to the speaking floor, not with the hungry speculation of a crowd looking for entertainment, with something more complicated, the attention of people who recognized, without being told, that they were watching a specific kind of person navigate a specific kind of threshold. The lead judge, Chief Arbiter Diel Corvus, was a man of 60 with the face of someone who had adjudicated enough human complexity to be done with the pretense that any of it was simple. He read the formal charges in the flat, declarative tone of official proceedings, each one landing in the chamber with its legal weight intact. "The Crown's advocate will present," he said. Crowell stood. He was, to his credit, thorough. He was also, to his credit, visibly uncomfortable with several of the arguments he was obligated to make, which he managed with the professional discipline of a man who had long since separated his personal judgment from his functional role and did not permit the former to compromise the latter. He cited covenant law. He cited precedent. He constructed the property arguments with precision and the residential obligation arguments with slightly less conviction, because the residential obligation arguments were, as both he and Thornvale knew, the weakest component of the Crown's case. When he finished, Corvus said, "The defense." Thornvale stood. He was even more thorough. He dismantled the property arguments with the ownership records. Instruments and equipment purchased independently before the bonding, documented in her mother's accounts, and in the independent practice records she had maintained in the Valhart Estates Medical Registry. He dismantled the residential obligation argument by citing 12 years of consistent, documented medical service that had operated as a semi-independent practice within the palace structure, a precedent of professional autonomy that predated and survived the bonding and had never been formally absorbed into the Crown's administrative portfolio. Then he looked at Seris. "The respondent will testify," Corvus said. She stood. The chamber settled into the particular silence of a room that has been paying attention and is about to be asked to pay more. She began with the facts: the date of departure, the route north, the establishment of practice at the Ember House, the patients served, the records maintained, the resources sourced, all of it precise, all of it documented, none of it defensive. Then she shifted. She did not signal the shift. She did not modulate her voice or alter her posture. She simply continued in the same register, the register of accurate testimony, and the content changed from the external architecture of what had happened to the internal architecture of why. "I spent 12 years in Ashthorn Palace," she said. "I want to be clear about what those years were and what they were not. They were not unhappy in the way that word is usually meant. I had resources. I had position. I had the formal apparatus of a crown's protection. These are real things, and I do not want to pretend they were nothing." She looked at the three judges in turn, not with appeal, with the direct, sustained attention of a woman who has decided that the people in front of her are going to receive the full weight of what she is saying. "What they were not," she continued, "was a life I had any authorship of. A physician is a person who has spent many years learning a specific discipline. The specific discipline is the daily, evidence-based work of maintaining human health against the consistent pressure of everything that wants to compromise it. It requires judgment. It requires documentation. It requires the freedom to be wrong in correctable ways and to learn from that. In the palace, I was permitted to have the credential of this discipline without being permitted to practice it as the discipline actually requires. I was useful in the way a decoration of a quality is useful. The quality is present, it is visible, it is spoken of in favorable terms, and it is never allowed to operate at full capacity, because full capacity would require space and attention and flexibility that the structure around it does not want to provide." The gallery was very still. "I did not leave because I was betrayed," she said. "I want to be accurate about this because the framing of betrayal is available and it is incomplete. I left because I heard myself described by my husband as a certainty." She paused. "She will remain loyal. She always does." These are not the words of a man describing a person. They are the words of a man describing a resource. And I understood in that moment that what I had mistaken for 12 years as a marriage, with all the complexity and reciprocity that word implies, was, from his side, more accurately described as a managed asset, something he owned, something that had proven reliable and was therefore no longer considered, something he did not need to think about because its behavior was predictable. She heard the gallery shift, not with drama, with the specific, barely audible sound of 60 people drawing breath at the same moment. "This is not unique to him," she said. "I want to be precise about that as well. It is the specific disease of power when power is not examined. A person who has never had to account for the cost their choices impose on others develops a certainty about the acceptability of those choices that is almost impossible to distinguish from authority, even from the inside. It looks like confidence. It looks like strength. It functions as neither. What it actually is the specific condition that results when someone never receives accurate feedback about the full weight of what they require from others. She let that sit for a moment. "I am not here to condemn the king," she said. "I am here to testify to what is true. What is true is that the charges brought against me use the mechanisms of imperial law to compel the return of a person who left of her own volition, with her own property, to practice her own profession in a territory where she is needed. The charges describe this as violation. What it actually is a woman making the first unconstrained choice she has made in 12 years. And the fact that this choice requires legal remedy in the Crown's estimation tells you something important about what the Crown believes it owns." She looked at the lead judge. "I am asking this tribunal to determine whether a woman's autonomy is property, because that is the actual question underneath the charges. Everything else is procedural framing." The room held what she had said in it for a long moment. Corvus looked at her for a period of time longer than the formalities required. Then he said, "Is there additional testimony?" "Yes," Seris said. She had not told Thornvail about this portion. She had not told Thornvail because she had decided it in the waystation room the night before, in the moment when Vaelor Draven had told her to let the grief be part of the record, and she had not yet fully resolved whether she was going to do it. And she had known that if she told Thornvail, he would give her excellent reasons not to, and that some of those reasons would be valid, and that all of them would be, in some essential way, beside the point. She said, "I loved him." The gallery held absolutely still. "I want that in the record," she said, "not as complication, as context, because the account of what happened inside that palace is not comprehensible without the fact that for at least the first several years, what I was doing there was not purely functional. I was not merely managing a political arrangement. I was trying to build something genuine with a person I respected and had chosen and believed, when I chose him, was capable of seeing me accurately." She paused. "He was. In those early years, he was capable of it. That capacity is not gone. It has been buried under 20 years of an education and power that taught him that what he held could not be lost, and that the people he held could not be treated as fully separate from what he held." Another pause. "I am also telling you this because the Crown's case rests, at bottom, on the premise that I violated a covenant. I am telling you that the covenant was already broken from the inside long before I walked out of that door. Not through any single act, through the slow, consistent substitution of management for recognition, through the replacement of a wife with a function, through the assumption that loyalty given freely is the same as loyalty that could not leave." She stood for a moment in the silence. "That is all," she said. She sat down. What happened in the 2 hours of deliberation that followed was not something that anyone in the gallery was permitted to observe. The 3 judges withdrew. The chamber continued to hold the weight of what had been said in it, not chattering, not buzzing with the social energy of a court proceeding that has provided sufficient spectacle, but sitting with it in the specific quiet of people who have heard something that has altered the cognitive landscape of the room. Thornvail leaned close to Seris and said, in a voice intended for no other ears, "The section at the end. I know. It was technically unnecessary. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "It was also the most honest thing said in a tribunal chamber in the 40 years I have been standing in them." He looked forward again. "I thought you should know that." She looked at the wall above the judges' seats and thought about a woman sitting in a waystation room telling her that the grief was not a weakness in the record, that it was the record. She thought about Vaelor. She had been not thinking about Vaelor with considerable discipline for 3 weeks, because thinking about him was not useful to the construction of what needed to be built. And she was a woman who had always been able to direct her attention with the same precision she directed everything else. But in this room, in this silence, with the full weight of what she had just said still present in the air, she permitted herself to think about him directly. Not with anger, not with the specific cold of the night she had packed her case and written one word and walked out into the dark. With the specific, unguarded grief of someone who had loved a particular person, not a king, not an alpha, not a sovereign, a person with specific qualities that had been genuinely worth loving and had watched those qualities become inaccessible over years, buried under accumulation of power and the habits of power, until the person she had fallen in love with existed only in the rare, unguarded moments when circumstance stripped away the crown for a second, and you could see him briefly, before the armor reassembled. She had been chasing those moments for a long time. She had decided, the night of the corridor, to stop. This decision had not made the grief go away. It had simply made the grief honest. The judges returned after 1 hour and 53 minutes. Corvus sat. He looked at both tables. He was a man who did not perform, which meant the absence of ceremony in his expression carried information. He said, "All charges are dismissed." He said it in the flat declarative of official proceeding, and then he said 4 more sentences that expanded the ruling. The property claims were invalid. The covenant breach provision did not apply in circumstances where the conditions of the covenant had already been materially compromised. The respondent's independent practice predated the bonding, and its continuation was legally unimpeachable. Then he stopped. He looked at Seris for a moment beyond the official record. "For the archive," he said, "this tribunal notes that the respondent's testimony has raised questions regarding the existing covenant law provisions that this panel believes warrant review by the full Imperial Legal Assembly. Specifically, the residential obligation statutes and their application to bonded parties with established independent professional practice." He paused. "The ruling stands as stated. The record is complete." He closed his book. The gallery did not erupt. It did not cheer or condemn. It absorbed what had happened with the quality of people who understood that they had witnessed something that would be referenced for a long time, and that the correct response to such a thing was not noise but attention. Thornvale was already gathering documents. Seris sat for a moment longer in the speaking floor's chair. She had won. She had known she would win, with reasonable probability, from the moment Thornvale had reviewed the evidence and told her the legal structure was sound. Winning had been the expected outcome. What she had not entirely anticipated was the specific quality of what winning felt like. Not triumph, not relief, but a particular heavy clarity, as though a mechanism that had been under enormous pressure had finally released, and the release itself was almost physically painful in the way of muscles held tense for too long that hurt when they finally rest. She picked up her physician case. She walked out of the chamber. Thornvale found her in the outer corridor, standing at one of the narrow windows that looked out over the Citadel's stone courtyard. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment. Then, from behind them, a voice said her name. She turned. The man standing at the corridor doorway was not in royal dress. He was not attended by staff or soldiers. He was wearing a traveling coat and looked like he had not slept in a period of time that she recognized clinically as significant, and he was standing very still in the way of someone who has been moving very fast for a very long time and has just stopped and is not certain what happens next. Vaelor Draven. He had come alone. He had apparently come a very long way in a very short time, because the coat he was wearing had road dust on it, and his face had the specific stripped quality of a man who has spent the last 3 days unable to manage himself into the calm and controlled presentation that was his most fundamental, most consistent armor. He was without it now. He looked at her from across the corridor. Thornvale said nothing. He was, after 40 years of legal work, a man who understood exactly when a corridor needed to be vacated, and he vacated it with the quiet efficiency of someone moving out of the path of something that was not his to witness. They stood in the corridor. The citadel held its stone silence around them. She had not seen him in 38 days. He looked different without the crown, without the context of the palace, without the specific architecture of performed authority that she had watched him wear for so long that she had sometimes forgotten it was worn. He looked like the man she had met in a medicinal garden at dusk 17 years ago, arguing with the wrong person about fever protocols. He had been on the wrong side of the argument but had recognized it within 4 minutes, which was the thing she had noticed first, and the thing she had never entirely stopped finding significant. He had come alone, to a tribunal he had filed against her. He said her name, just her name, in the voice of someone who has been rehearsing a speech and has arrived at the moment of delivering it and discovered that the speech is entirely wrong. She waited. He said, "I read your testimony." She was quiet. They made a transcript while the judges were deliberating. His voice was rough. "Krall sent it to me." "Krall sent you the transcript?" "He sent it with a note that said he thought I should read it before the ruling. He said—" Vaelor stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment with the expression of a man confronting something enormous in a narrow space. "He said he had spent 40 years serving the crown, and he was not willing to continue serving it in this particular direction. He said he was resigning the crown portfolio. She waited. I read it in a carriage, riding north. He looked up. I read it twice before I got on a horse. She studied his face with the same attention she gave everything. Not looking for what she wanted to find, looking for what was actually there. And what was there was not the performed accountability of a powerful man making a strategic adjustment. It was not the calculated vulnerability of someone who had identified emotion as a useful instrument in this specific negotiation. It was the face of someone who had been struck by something and was still, in some real physiological sense, in the immediate aftermath of it. She had not seen this face before. Not from him, not once in 17 years. She said, "Why are you here?" "Because I needed to—" He stopped again. He was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. She had never seen him stop in the middle of a sentence. "Because what you said in that room, about what I did," he breathed. "It was true." "I know it was true. I knew it was true when you heard me in that corridor," he said. "I knew it, and I spent 12 hours building a different version of it before I found your note. And then I spent 3 weeks using every mechanism available to me to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. The armor was trying to reassemble, and he was doing something she had genuinely never seen him do. He was refusing to let it. "I filed charges because I could, not because I had a case. Because I needed to feel like I was doing something instead of sitting with what I'd done." She looked at him. "That is the truth," he said. "Not a version of it. The complete truth of it." They stood in the corridor. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of the weight of the physician case in her hand, the same case she had packed 38 days ago in a room where candles had been carefully extinguished, aware of the 38 days of work and testimony and a dying woman's truth in a way station room and the specific, hard-won clarity that all of those days had deposited in her. She was also aware, with the honesty that she had committed herself to in the tribunal chamber, that some part of her had not stopped loving him, that the grief was real, and the love was real, and the damage was real, and none of those three things invalidated the others. She had said as much in the chamber, into the official record. He was standing in front of her now, not as king, as the person underneath it. She said, "I'm not ready to have this conversation." Something moved through his expression. Not defeat. Something more complicated. "Okay. That's not a refusal." He looked at her. "Okay. I'm going back to Hollowmere," she said. "I have a patient arriving tomorrow morning. I have work." "I know. What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that she had not anticipated and that she would think about in the weeks that followed with the same careful attention she gave everything that mattered. He said, "I resigned the throne this morning before I left for the Citadel. The formal transfer papers are with the council. Riveth has the interim authority documents." He paused. "I didn't do it to follow you. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I have been king for 20 years, and I have done it without understanding that authority without accountability is just a different word for what my father was, and I would rather not be that anymore." She looked at him for a long time, and the cliffhanger that no one in the corridor could have resolved. Not Thornvale watching from the far end, not the relay men who would later tell the story in way station common rooms across the north, not even the man standing in front of her, was this: what Seris Vaelhart did next. Because she had been trained for 12 years to respond to this man from the position of the person with less to lose. She no longer was that person. She had her own ground now, and what she did from ground like that, what any person does when they finally have something real to stand on, and the person who once asked them to shrink themselves comes back without the crown and without the armor and without anything except the bare, insufficient, possibly just enough fact of having finally chosen truth over the performance of it, was not a question that testimony or legal argument or her mother's journals or even a dying woman's hard-won wisdom had prepared her for. She would have to decide it herself, and she had not yet decided. She stood in that corridor for 11 seconds after he finished speaking. 11 seconds is not a long time in the mathematics of ordinary life. 11 seconds is how long it takes to pour a cup of water, to read 2 sentences, to cross a small room. But in the mathematics of a moment where everything that has been moving in one direction suddenly encounters the possibility of moving in another 11 seconds is the entire geography of a decision. It is long enough to feel the full weight of what is being offered and the full weight of what accepting it would cost, and to understand that those two weights are not the same and cannot be made the same by any amount of wishing. She said, "Come to Hollowmere." Not as invitation, as condition. "Not now," she said. "Not tomorrow. Give me 2 weeks to finish what I've started there. Then come. Come without staff, without ceremony, without any apparatus of what you were. Come as a person who needs to learn what it looks like to live inside a community that doesn't exist to serve your requirements." He looked at her steadily. And then we'll see what there is to say to each other. She left. The road north took 3 days in winter, and Seris spent those 3 days doing what she always did when she needed to process something enormous. She worked. She stopped at 2 settlements between the Citadel and Hollowmere territory, treated what needed treating, documented everything, and arrived back at Ember House on the morning of the 4th day to find Tomas sitting on her front step eating a piece of hard bread and looking at her with the specific expression he reserved for situations where he had information and had been waiting long enough that the information had started to feel like a burden. "There's been men," he said. She looked at him. "What kind of men?" "The quiet kind. The kind that don't wear house colors." He broke off another piece of bread. 3 of them came 2 days ago. Talked to Foreman Aldrich at the mine and to the Mirathane road officer. Stayed 1 night at the common house and left." He paused. "Asked about you specifically, about how many patients you see, how far people come to find you, whether you have staff." Seris was still. "Aldrich told them you see about 40 patients a week, and that some of them come from as far as the Halveth Pass," Tomas said. "I don't know what the road officer told them. He's been quiet about it." She went inside and set her case on the table and stood in the center of her workroom for a moment, looking at nothing particular. Quiet men asking specific questions about her operation was not something that could be resolved by assigning it to one category. It was consistent with a number of things. It was consistent with Provincial Health Administration conducting a routine survey. Though Provincial Health Administration was not known for conducting anything in winter and never used men who didn't wear house colors, it was consistent with the Crown's continued interest in her movements following the tribunal. Though the tribunal had concluded 3 days ago and the charges had been formally dismissed. It was consistent with something else entirely, something she had not yet fully constructed, but whose outline she could see at the edge of her thinking, like the shadow of a building whose structure is not yet visible. She wrote a short message to Thornvale and sent Tomas with it on the afternoon horse. She treated 7 patients that day. A woman with a wound that had been improperly dressed for a week, 2 minors with the early-stage lung inflammation she was beginning to understand as a systemic problem in this territory rather than individual incidents, a child with a broken wrist, and 3 others with the varied, practical urgencies of a population that had limited access to care and had learned to tolerate a great deal before seeking it. She worked until dark. She did not think about Vaelor. This was not entirely true. She thought about him in the spaces between concentration that are unavoidable in any long working day. The moment of transition between one patient and the next, the mechanical portions of preparation that did not require her full attention. She thought about his face in the corridor, about the specific, undefended quality of it, about the fact that he had resigned a throne, which was not a performative gesture because there was no audience for it. He had done it before he came to the Citadel, before he knew what she would say, before he had any information about how she would receive it. He had done it because it was what the truth required. She recognized that. She respected it, even. She also understood that recognition and respect were not the same as readiness, and that readiness was not something she could manufacture on a timeline that served his urgency. She had her ground now. She was not going to leave it for the convenience of his transformation. Thornvale arrived at Ember House 6 days after the tribunal. He had not been 6 days on the road. He had spent 3 of those days in the capital doing what Thornvale did when he was concerned about something, gathering information with the systematic patience of a man who understood that incomplete information was almost always more dangerous than no information at all. He sat across from her at the workroom table and put a folder of documents between them and looked at her with the expression of a man who wishes he had different information to deliver. "The men Tomas saw," he said. "They work for the House of Corvain." The House of Corvain, Lady Nicera Corvain, The southern warhouses. The voice through the half-open door. Seris looked at the folder without opening it. What do they want? That's the question I've been trying to answer. Thornvale opened the folder himself, turned it toward her. What I know is this. In the 3 weeks since Vaelor resigned the throne, the interim governance question has become the central political reality in the capital. The council has 7 members. 4 of them are aligned with the Southern Warhouse Coalition. Reveth has the interim authority documents, but Reveth is a general, not a politician. And the coalition knows exactly how to work around a general when the general doesn't have a king behind him. They're positioning for the succession. They've been positioning for the succession for longer than 3 weeks. What changed 3 weeks ago is that the throne is actually available. He put his finger on a document midway through the stack. House Corvain has put forward a candidate. Nicera Corvain's younger brother, Aldrich Corvain. Military record. Provincial management experience. The coalition's preferred option. He has the 4 council votes he needs to install himself as interim sovereign, pending a formal succession assembly. Seris was quiet. The succession assembly requires a quorum of provincial elders, Thornvale said. There are 7 provincial elder councils. The 4 coalition-aligned councils will vote for Corvain. The 3 northern and eastern councils are unaligned. Historically, they vote with whoever holds the strongest legitimate claim. He paused. The strongest legitimate claim to the Varethian throne, after Vaelor's abdication, is a question that the existing succession law does not answer cleanly, because the abdication statutes have not been invoked in over a century, and the legal language is, frankly, ambiguous. What does the ambiguous language leave open? It leaves open the question of whether the bonding covenant, even in its current severed state, creates a residual succession right that... He stopped. He looked at her directly. I'm going to say this plainly. There is a legal argument, not a strong one but a functional one, that your status as the Alpha Sovereign's bonded consort, prior to any formal dissolution of the covenant, creates a standing that the unaligned provincial councils would recognize as superior to a coalition candidate with no dynastic connection. She understood immediately what he was saying. They sent men to survey my operation, she said, because they wanted to know how entrenched I am here. They wanted to know whether removing you from the equation would be logistically feasible before the succession assembly convenes. He let that sit in the air for exactly the right amount of time. The assembly convenes in 30 days. She looked at him. Define removing. Discrediting preferably. Legal mechanisms if possible. There are provisions in the covenant dissolution statutes that could be used to formally sever your standing before the assembly convenes if they can find a sympathetic arbiter. He paused. The alternative to legal mechanisms is the kind of thing that historically gets attributed to road accidents and winter illness. The fire in the Ember House spoke its low, continuous language. This was the kind of moment that arrives in a life without announcement, not dressed as a crisis, not preceded by any warning architecture that a person could have prepared for. It arrives in the middle of an ordinary evening in a workroom that smells of pine and dried herb and the specific mineral quality of winter coming through the stones. And it requires you to reckon with the fact that the world you thought you were navigating has a different geography than the one you were using. She had left the palace to practice medicine. She had built something real in this territory. She had stood in a tribunal chamber and told the truth about 12 years and won on the merits of what was factually true. And she had walked out of that chamber believing that the geography of her life had simplified, that she was now in a country whose borders she had defined herself, practicing a discipline she had chosen, accountable to people she had chosen to be accountable to. What Thornvale was describing was the world informing her that she did not get to define the borders, because power does not relinquish its interest in a person simply because that person has stopped being interested in power. This is one of the cruelest mechanics of the systems that organize human society. That departure is not the same as freedom, that the act of leaving a structure does not remove you from the structure's attention, and that the most dangerous position in any political architecture is not the position of the person in the center of it, but the position of the person who has become unexpectedly valuable to multiple competing interests without having sought to be valuable to any of them. She had become, without intending to, a piece on a board she had explicitly walked away from. "What does Vaelor know about this?" she said. I don't know. Does he know about the Corvain candidacy? He resigned the throne in the morning and was on a horse by afternoon. I don't know what information he had access to before he left the capital. She stood up. She moved to the window, not the north-facing one that looked toward the frozen marshland, but the east-facing one that looked toward the settlement, toward the warm geometry of its lights against the winter dark. Ember House had been built on the eastern edge of the territory for a reason. This window was part of that reason. You could see from here what the settlement was, not a political unit, not a provincial asset, but a collection of people who had been trying to survive in difficult conditions for a long time, and who had, in the last several weeks, had slightly better odds of doing it than they had before. This was what she had built. Not a legal argument, not a political position, not a succession standing. This. How serious is the physical risk, she said. Thornvale was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is calibrating honesty against protection and has decided that honesty is more important. Serious enough that I came here in 6 days instead of taking a week, he said. The survey team was not a survey team. 2 of the 3 men have documented histories of service in the Corvain private garrison. She turned from the window. I need to contact Reveth. That's what I came to tell you to do. And I need to reach Vaelor. That, Thornvale said carefully, is more complicated. Why? Because 3 days ago, before I left the capital, something happened that changed the configuration of the council. He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering the second difficult piece of information in an already difficult conversation, which is its own particular kind of threshold. Reveth was removed from the interim authority, not through force, through a council vote that was called before he understood it was being called, a procedural maneuver that the Corvain bloc had apparently been preparing for weeks in anticipation of exactly the scenario that occurred. He paused. The motion cited concerns about a military officer holding civilian governance authority without formal election. It passed 4-3. Who holds the interim authority now? The council chair, Mercen Crowell, on both Sung. She went still. Crowell, who had resigned the crown portfolio. Crowell, who had sent Vaelor the transcript of her testimony with a note saying he was not willing to continue serving in this particular direction. Crowell is holding the interim authority, she said, and the Corvain bloc has 4 council votes. Yes, they don't have 5. No, because Crowell won't vote with them. Crowell is... Thornvale paused. Crowell is a man of 40 years of legal service who resigned a royal portfolio on principle and took a governance position he didn't want because the alternative was watching a Warhouse coalition install their candidate through a procedural vacuum. He is holding that authority by the width of 1 vote on a council that has 4 people actively working to remove him. He looked at her steadily. He sent me a message 2 days ago. He said, "Tell her the structure will hold for 30 days, but only 30. And tell her that the northern provincial elders are watching what happens at Ember House as a proxy for whether the territory of Hollowmere has someone worth aligning behind." The room held what that sentence contained for a long moment. She had not left the palace to become a political figure. She had left to practice medicine. She was standing in a workroom in a healing sanctuary she had built with her own labor in a frontier territory, and the Empire had reached its long arm across the distance she had made and laid it on her shoulder and was telling her, without asking her permission, without caring whether she consented, that the thing she had built here had political weight, whether she assigned it that weight or not. This is the specific violence of historical momentum, that it does not negotiate with individual intention. A woman builds a sanctuary and treats minors and documents fever protocols, and the Empire decides that what she has done is take a position. A man resigns a throne and rides north, and the coalition decides that what he has done is create a vacancy. Intention is irrelevant. What matters to the machinery of power is what you represent. And what Seris Valhart represented, whether she had meant to or not, was exactly what the northern provincial councils had been waiting for: a legitimate, documented, publicly credentialed alternative to the coalition's candidate that had the specific quality of not having been manufactured by any existing power structure. She had manufactured it herself, patient by patient, remedy by remedy, case note by case note, over 38 days. The knock at the door arrived at the exact moment that she had organized all of this into its correct shape in her mind. Not as a plan, but as a reckoning. As the accurate picture of what the situation actually was. Tomas opened the door before she reached it, which he did when he felt that whatever was outside it was urgent enough to override the protocol she had established about who opened the Ember House door after dark. The man on the step was not from Hollowmere. He was young, travel-exhausted, wearing the unmarked coat of someone who had been specifically instructed not to advertise his origins. And he was holding a sealed message with a trembling hand. Trembling not from cold, but from the specific physiological state of someone who has been riding hard for a long time on an urgent commission and has finally arrived and is managing the adrenaline of arrival. From General Revith, he said. He said it was the most important message he has ever sent, and that I was not to give it to anyone except the healer of Ember House. She took it. She broke the seal. She read it. Thornvale watched her face as she read it, which was a professional habit he had developed across 4 decades of receiving difficult information in rooms with clients. And what he saw in her face was the specific sequence that he had learned to recognize as the progression from comprehension to implication to consequence. The face of a person absorbing not just what is written, but what is written requires. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it as though looking at a document that had not yet finished delivering its contents. Reveth's letter was short. It said, Vaelor arrived in Hollowmere 4 days ago, not to Ember House. He has been working in the Eastern Settlement Council for 3 days on the Water Channel dispute and has said nothing to no one about who he is. Last night, a man matching the description of Corvain's garrison captain was seen at the Common House in Halveth 2 hours from where Vaelor is staying. I have no official authority to protect him, and I am writing this without his knowledge. He does not know about the Corvain candidacy. He does not know what he wrote into. She was on her feet before Thornvale had finished reading over her shoulder. Your horse is faster than mine, she said. Seris, how much faster? 2 hours on a good road. The Eastern settlement is 40 minutes. She was already moving. Coat, physician case, out of habit, and out of the bone-deep understanding that she never left the building without it. You cannot ride into whatever is at that common house with a physician's case as your Caedric. She turned at the door. Her face was not afraid. It was not performing calm either. It was the face of someone who has determined what the situation requires and is moving toward it without the luxury of deliberation. He came here without protection because he was trying to do what I asked him to do. He does not know what he's walking toward. And you going there alone? I'm not going there to fight anyone. I'm going there because I know this territory and the people in it, and I have 40 minutes on a man who doesn't know either of those things. She looked at him steadily. Send the fastest message you can to Reveth's man at Halveth Pass. Tell him to get to the Eastern Settlement Common House. Tell him Reveth authorized it. Reveth doesn't have authorization anymore. Tell him anyway. She went out. The road to the Eastern Settlement ran along the river for the first mile and then cut through the frozen scrub on the high ground above the marsh. And she rode it in the dark at a pace that required her complete attention because she knew this road, and still, in the dark, there were places where the ice made the footing dangerous and a wrong decision would cost time she did not have. She thought, as she rode, about what Reveth's letter meant in its fullness. Vaelor had come to Hollowmere 4 days ago. 4 days ago was 2 days after the tribunal. He had done exactly what she had asked him to do. Come without ceremony, without staff, without the apparatus of what he was. He had come and found work to do and done it without announcing himself, which was either an act of genuine humility or the most sophisticated performance of genuine humility she had ever encountered, and she could not afford, in this moment, to spend energy resolving that distinction. He was in a territory he didn't know. He had no protection. The Corvain garrison captain was 2 hours away on a road that also led to the Eastern Settlement. She knew what the garrison captain was there to do. Not because Reveth's letter had spelled it out. It hadn't. But because she understood the mechanics of what she was now inside. The succession assembly was in 29 days. The Corvain block needed her standing severed before it convened. The cleanest way to sever her standing was to formally dissolve the covenant. The cleanest way to force a formal dissolution was to create conditions under which the Alpha Party in the covenant was publicly, irrevocably compromised in a way that made continuation of any legal connection untenable. A deposed king, traveling incognito to be near his estranged bonded consort, discovered in a compromising situation engineered by people who understood exactly how the story would be written in the official account. Or something worse than a compromising situation, something that would not require the legal architecture of dissolution at all. She pushed the horse harder. The horse. The eastern settlement was smaller than the main Hollowmere community. 43 households, a common house, a mill, the water channel system that had been the subject of dispute since the summer's drought had complicated the allocation between the mill operation and the residential use. It was exactly the kind of localized infrastructure dispute that a man with 20 years of experience in provincial governance could make himself useful resolving, without anyone needing to know anything about him except that he was competent and willing to work. She saw the lights of the common house from the high ground above the settlement. She saw something else, too. 2 horses tied at the side of the building, in the shadow space between the common house and the storage outbuilding, tied in the particular way of animals placed where they would not be immediately visible from the road. She came off the high ground at a walk. She tied her own horse at the front of the building, in full view, in the way of someone who had no interest in being unobserved, and went through the common house door. The common room held 7 people. 3 settlement men she recognized from medical work, Aldrich the foreman, the miller's eldest son, and a man named Fen who repaired the water channels, a woman behind the bar who was Fen's wife, and who ran the common house with the specific no-nonsense competence of someone who had been watching human foolishness for long enough to have developed efficient responses to most of its forms. And 2 men at the far table who were not from this settlement and whose posture, even seated, had the particular quality of people who are managing the visible portion of their attention while the real portion was directed elsewhere. And Vaelor. He was at the center table with Aldrich and the miller's son, and a set of land survey maps spread between them, in the clothes of a working man, plain wool, no insignia, nothing that identified him as anything except what he appeared to be, which was someone who knew what he was looking at on a map and was using that knowledge in direct service of the men across from him. He looked up when she came through the door. Something crossed his face. Not surprise, not quite. More like a man who sees an unexpected development and is already, in the same second, calculating what it means. She did not go to him immediately. She went to the bar. "Mira," she said to Fen's wife, "I need water, and whatever you have warm." Mira looked at her with the particular intelligence of a woman who has run a public house for 20 years and knows what it looks like when someone has ridden hard and is managing more than they are showing. She poured water without comment and went to the fire for the warm pot. The 2 men at the far table had looked at her when she came in and were now performing the careful disinterest of people who are not interested. She drank the water. She let the room continue its rhythms for 3 minutes. Then she walked to Vaelor's table. "I need a word," she said. She said it in the tone of a Hollowmere healer speaking to a settlement worker, nothing exceptional in it, nothing that would read as significant to anyone not already paying close attention. He read her face. He stood without questioning it, folded the map section he had been working from, and said to Aldrich, "Give me a few minutes." They went to the back corridor, the narrow passage between the common room and the storage outbuilding, used in the summer for air circulation and in winter for the hanging of cured meat and the storage of dry goods. The door closed behind them. She said very quietly, "Tell me you understand what position you are in." He looked at her steadily. "I know I don't have protection. That's the smallest part of it," she told him. Quickly, precisely, the way she gave critical information to someone in a clinical emergency. Everything necessary, nothing extraneous, in the order that allowed the listener to understand the full picture before being required to respond to any part of it. She told him about the Corvain candidacy, about the council vote that removed Riveth, about Kral's 30-day hold, about the survey team, about what she understood to be the purpose of the 2 men currently sitting at the far table in the common room not 20 feet from where they were standing. He was very still. This was different from his political stillness, the managed, armored stillness of Ashthorn Palace. This was the stillness of someone receiving information that is restructuring the geography of the world they thought they were in. The stillness of recalibration. "Corvain has been planning this since before I resigned," he said. "Yes." She knew I would resign. She looked at him. "Did you tell her?" Something moved in his jaw. "Not directly, but she—" He stopped. He looked at the wall for a moment in the way of a man performing an audit of his own recent history and finding entries he does not like. She was in the palace the night before I left for the Citadel. She came to the strategy room. She said she had heard about the tribunal and that she wanted to express her concern about the crown's direction. He paused. I told her I was going north. I told her I had decided the threshold we had crossed was... He stopped again. I told her enough. She used it. She used everything I told her. His voice was flat, not with the flatness of a man suppressing anger, with the flatness of a man who has arrived at a specific, cold understanding and is sitting inside it with the full weight of its implications. I handed her the timing. There are betrayals that arrive as shock, sudden, catastrophic, incomprehensible, and there are betrayals that arrive as completion. The final piece of a pattern you had enough information to see but chose not to see, because seeing it would have required admitting that you had been operating in a world less reliable than the one you preferred. The second kind is worse in some ways than the first. It does not have the mercy of being entirely unexpected. Vaelor had trusted Nycera Corvain with information because she had been a constant in his life for years, not in the way the corridor conversation had made visible, but in the older, more structural way of a political relationship that had lasted long enough to become background noise. People you have known for years occupy a specific category of trust that is not fully examined because it has become, through sheer familiarity, assumed. This is one of the most reliable mechanisms of betrayal across every human context that has ever existed. It does not require malice in the betrayer to succeed. It requires only the combination of a person's willingness to be useful to their own interests and another person's willingness to stop examining the reliability of someone they have stopped thinking of as a variable. He had made her a certainty. The specific bitter irony of this was not lost on him. He had accused Seris, by omission and assumption, of the same category error he had now made about someone else entirely. "The two men in the common room," he said. "What are they here to do?" She held his eyes. "I don't know the exact form of it. I know enough." He was quiet for a moment. "If I walk out of Hollowmere," he said, "the Corvain candidacy advances unopposed." "Yes. If I stay without protection, I'm a target in territory I don't know." "Yes." "And if they succeed in formally dissolving the covenant before the succession assembly, your residual succession standing, ambiguous as it is, disappears. And mine with it." She paused. "Which removes the only legitimate alternative to the Corvain candidate from the northern province's consideration." He looked at her. "You're not going back to the palace?" "No." "Then what does legitimate alternative mean to you?" "It means," she said carefully, "that what I built here has weight, and that the weight of it, combined with the weight of what you were before you resigned, is apparently significant enough that a coalition of warhouses has sent two men to a common house in a frontier settlement to manage it." She held his gaze. "I did not walk out of Ashthorn to become a political figure, but I also did not walk out to hand the empire to the first warhouse that moved fast enough to claim the vacuum." He said, "What do you want to do?" And this was the question, not asked in the palace register, not asked by a man managing toward a predetermined outcome, asked in the register of a man who was genuinely, without armor or precedent or any of the familiar machinery of authority, asking a person he had wronged and was not yet certain had forgiven him, and could not be certain he had the right to ask, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him for a long moment in the cold, cured meat-smelling corridor of a common house in a frontier territory at the edge of the empire they had both, in very different ways, tried to leave behind. Then the door at the far end of the corridor opened. One of the two men from the common room stood in it. He had a short blade. He was not pointing it yet. He was holding it the way a man holds a tool he expects to need shortly, with the casual readiness of someone who has done this before and is not concerned about the outcome. "The former king," he said, "is requested to accompany us to Halveth for a conversation regarding the succession assembly." Vaelor looked at the man. Then he looked at Seris, and she saw in his face the exact moment when every remaining piece of the armor, every last constructed layer of the king, the sovereign, the alpha, who had ruled 7 provinces through 2 decades of unquestioned authority, fell away. Not because he was defeated, because he finally understood, with his whole body and not just his mind, that there was exactly one way through this corridor, and it had nothing to do with authority and nothing to do with power. and everything to do with the person standing beside him, and whether, in the next 60 seconds, he was going to be the man she had asked him to become or the man he had spent 20 years being. The blade was between them and the door. Tomas was outside somewhere. Raveth's man from the pass was 40 minutes away if Thornvale's message had reached him. And in the silence of the corridor, with the common house fire audible through the wall and the winter dark absolute beyond the storage door, Vaelor Draven made a choice that was not calculated, not strategic, not calibrated to outcome. He stepped in front of her, not in the way of a king protecting an asset, in the way of a man who has finally, irrevocably chosen one thing over everything else he has ever been. The man with the blade watched this and recalculated. And outside in the winter dark hooves Raveth's man. Or not. The door at the far end was still open. The fire was still audible through the wall. And everything that came next would determine not just what happened in a corridor in a frontier settlement, but what Varethia became in the 30 days remaining before the succession assembly, and what two people, stripped of every convenience and defense, and performed certainty, would find themselves capable of building from the bones of what had nearly destroyed them both. The man with the blade made his second mistake in the same breath as his first. His first mistake was opening the door too early. A professional would have waited until the common room emptied, until the witnesses were gone, until the geography of the situation had been managed, before introducing steel into it. He had opened the door because the conversation in the corridor had run longer than his patience permitted. And patience, in the profession he practiced, was the difference between a clean outcome and a complicated one. His second mistake was looking at Vaelor. He should have looked at Seris. She had already moved, not toward the blade, not toward the door. She moved laterally to the shelf on the right wall where the common house stored dry goods, specifically to the second shelf, where Mira kept the tall ceramic canisters of preserving salt, each one approximately 4 pounds of dense mineral-packed ceramic, and she took the nearest one in both hands and threw it at the man's left temple with the specific, controlled force of a woman who had spent 38 days doing the physical labor of a building that no one else was going to maintain for her. The canister connected hard. He didn't go down. He went sideways into the doorframe, and that gave Vaelor the 2 seconds he needed. Vaelor crossed the corridor in 3 strides and hit the man while he was still processing the impact. Not with theatrical violence, but with the compact, economical brutality of someone trained in close combat at 14 and who had not lost the muscle memory of it, despite 2 decades of not needing it personally. Elbow into the sternum. Drive him back through the door and onto the storage outbuilding floor. The blade skittered across the boards. Vaelor got there first. The man on the floor was breathing. Stunned, ribs cracked probably, not going anywhere in the next 30 seconds. Vaelor looked at Seris in the doorway. She was already looking at the common room wall, which was the real problem, because there had been 2 men at the far table, and one was contained, and she had no idea where the second had gone. "Front," she said. He went. She went back through the common room door, fast, into the warm noise of the space where Aldrich and the miller's son were on their feet in the instinctive way of men who have heard a commotion and haven't yet decided which direction to point themselves. The second man was not in the room. Mira was behind the bar with her hand on something under the counter. "Out the front, 20 seconds ago." Seris went through the front door. The night outside was absolute and cold, and the kind of dark that exists when cloud cover takes out every source of ambient light. In that dark she heard hooves, multiple horses, not one rider from the Halveth Pass, more than one. She stood on the step and listened, because listening is what you do when seeing isn't available, and she had learned to trust what her hearing told her in difficult conditions. 3 horses, South Road, coming fast, which could mean Raveth's man, which could also mean the rest of the Corvain garrison, because 2 men at a table was never the full deployment for an operation of this consequence. Vaelor appeared at her side from the front corner of the building, breathing elevated, blade in hand, face stripped down to the specific present tense focus of someone running on adrenaline and using the pause to recalibrate. 3, he said. "I hear them." They waited. There is a particular quality to the seconds before an unknown resolves, a suspended state the body experiences as tension but is actually something more fundamental. Every sensory system narrows, every extraneous thought compresses. What remains is pure animal attention, the same attention that exists in every creature caught between flight and fight. This is what strips a person down to what they actually are, not the comfortable moments, not the moments of authority and warm certainty, the moments when the hooves are coming from the south and you do not yet know whose they are. Vaelor Draven, standing in winter dark outside a frontier common house, with a blade taken from a man who worked for the woman who had maneuvered him out of his throne, was in that moment more genuinely himself than he had been in 20 years of ruling, because the empire had been a container for his authority. Remove the container and you find out what the authority was actually made of. Some men discover the structure was all there was. Some men discover something underneath it. The hooves resolved into shapes at the edge of the settlement's light. The first rider pulled up with the controlled abruptness of a practiced horseman and looked down at them both, assessing, rapid, professional. Not Corvain, Riveth's man, young, sharp-eyed, built for speed. He took in the blade in Vaelor's hand, the physician's case still in Seris's grip, and said nothing that wasn't necessary. "Healer Valhart, there are 2 more at the Halveth Junction. We split to cover both roads." "There's 1 man contained in the storage building," Seris said. "He needs restraint and a ride to the provincial garrison post." The rider dismounted and went without asking for elaboration. Vaelor watched him go, then looked at the south road. "If there are more, the other 2 riders cover the choke point." She looked at him. "Thornville will have sent to Reveth's capital contact. There will be an official inquiry into the garrison captain's presence in this territory before morning." "Which gives us tonight." He turned to face her. His voice had come down from the adrenaline into something lower, something that cost more than the adrenaline had. "Seris, not yet," she said. I know what you need to say." Without heat, without the specific cold of the night, she had packed her case and written 1 word and walked out into the dark. "I was standing beside you. I saw it." He was quiet. "That's not the conversation we need to have right now." She looked toward the common house door. "Right now we need to talk about 30 days and a succession assembly and what we're going to do about the fact that Corvain has 4 votes on a council and is going to spend every one of those days dismantling every alternative before the assembly convenes." He looked at her for a moment. "You said you didn't leave Ashthorn to become a political figure." "I didn't. But I also didn't leave to hand the empire to a warhouse coalition because I was too principled to engage." She held his gaze. "The miners with damaged lungs are going to live under whoever controls the provincial administration. The women who bring children to Ember House at dawn are going to live under it. My refusal to engage doesn't protect them from the consequences of who wins." This is the remorseless logic that comes for people who care about real things. Idealism of a certain kind can stay pure because it never makes contact with actual consequence. It maintains integrity in the clean, abstract space of what one refuses to compromise. But when the people you have chosen to be accountable to are the ones who pay the price of your integrity, the calculation changes. Not because integrity stops mattering, because integrity that costs nothing is not integrity. It is convenience dressed in principle. "Tell me about the assembly," Vaelor said. She told him. 30 days, 7 provincial elder councils, 4 aligned with Corvain, 3 unaligned. 5 needed to confirm a successor. Thornvale's read on the northern councils, watching Ember House as a proxy for whether this territory was worth aligning behind. He processed it with the speed of a man for whom governance architecture was the native language of 20 years of daily practice. "They need to discredit you before the assembly," he said, "formally through covenant dissolution or operationally, making this territory ungovernable, making your practice untenable. Tonight was the first move we know about. There will be more." He looked at the south road, then back at her. "I can't give you protection I don't officially have anymore." The resignation was real. No garrison, no council authority, no legal apparatus. "I know that. What I have," he said, and his voice shifted into the register of a man building toward something genuine in real time, rather than performing certainty, is 20 years of provincial law, a detailed understanding of every political obligation that coalition has created that could be called due, and the specific knowledge of which 3 of Corvain's 4 council votes are held through loyalty and which one is held through debt. He paused. I know which kind is movable. She looked at him.
You don't need my authority, he said. You never did. You need what 20 years of authority accumulates. He said it without self-pity and without the grandiosity of a man performing his own usefulness. Plain fact, offered by someone who had finally figured out the correct way to be useful. Tell me what Thornvale knows about Councilman Aldrin Foss. They went back inside.
Mira had restored this common room with the practical efficiency of a woman for whom chaos was a temporary state that yielded to organization if engaged firmly enough. Aldrich and the others were still there, watching the two of them with the attention of people who have witnessed something and are waiting to understand what it means. Aldrich spoke first because he always did. You're the man who's been working the water channel survey 3 days. Yes, Vaelor said. You're also the king, former king. Aldrich measured him with the evaluating quality of a foreman, deciding whether what he's been told matches what he's observed. Then he looked at Seris. Is he the reason those men came tonight? Partly, she said. They came because of both of us. More measuring. Then, the allocation model he built today for the seasonal variants. That solves the mill operation and the residential supply simultaneously. Nobody's managed that in 3 years. He paused. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what I'm about to say carries weight. The settlement will back the healer. We made our minds up about that already. And if she's decided you're worth backing, he looked at Vaelor, we'll extend that provisionally. Mira set cups on the bar. Sit down, she said, in the tone of a woman who has watched enough decisions being made standing up to know how that generally ends. They sat. Vaelor spread the survey maps to one side and opened his working journal to a blank page. He looked at Seris. Tell me what Thornvale knows about Foss. She told him. He listened. Then he started writing. What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic in the way the corridor had been dramatic. No blade, no adrenaline. A man who had governed an empire for 20 years, and a woman who had documented the architecture of power from inside it for 12 of those years, sitting at a table with maps and journals, and the combined intelligence of two people who understood the same system from two entirely different vantage points, and had never, until this night, been permitted to operate in the same direction simultaneously. Because this is what power structures are almost never designed to accommodate. The full combination of the person who holds formal authority and the person who does the actual load-bearing work. The system almost always keeps them separate because integration would redistribute credit in ways the formal authority finds threatening. Keep them separated and the authority remains the visible party. Let them combine and you produce something the system has no adequate response to. Vaelor knew which debt Aldrin Foss owed and to whom. Seris knew what Foss had been doing with the northern provincial medical contracts for 3 years, and who had been quietly covering for it. Together, these two pieces constituted leverage that neither piece alone had been. Reveth's rider returned from the storage building carrying the contained man's papers and a letter of commission bearing Aldrich Corvain's household seal. Not the kind of document a private citizen carries in a frontier territory, unless operating with the confidence of someone who believes it will never need explaining. Vaelor read it. His face had the quality of a man performing a final, definitive reassessment. She knew I would be in Hollowmere, he said. Nisera told her brother. The night you told her you were going north, Seris said. He set the letter on the table and looked at it. This is the moment that separates men of power who grow from men of power who harden, the moment when the full picture of a betrayal becomes visible, not just the act but the architecture of it, the timeline of its construction, the calculation that was running behind the face of someone you trusted while they were building the mechanism of your undoing. This moment offers 2 exits. One is toward rage, toward recalibrating identity as a wronged party, toward authority rebuilt on the legitimacy of grievance. This exit is well-traveled and does not require you to change. The other exit is narrower and colder and requires you to ask not just what was done to you, but what you enabled. He looked at the letter for a long time. Then he said, I enabled this. Not for her benefit, not as performance, as plain fact. Not entirely, Seris said. Enough. He looked up. I told her I was going north. I left the capital without a succession plan because I was moving toward you, and I didn't want that calculation complicated by the mechanics of an ordered transfer. I wanted a clean break, and I made it too cleanly, and I left a vacuum.
He held her gaze. I did not cause what Corvain chose to do, but I gave it the space to operate. She looked at him for a long moment.
This is the thing that cannot be manufactured and has no functional substitute in any architecture of redemption, a person accounting accurately for their own contribution to a situation that hurt them, not minimizing the wrong done by others, not disappearing into self-flagellation. Accurate accounting. The specific, difficult precision of saying, here's the line between what was done to me and what I made possible. She had been waiting, without fully knowing she was waiting, for something exactly like this. Not the gesture in the corridor, not the resignation, not the coming north without ceremony. This. She said, then we have 30 days. He looked at her. 29, she said. One is already gone. Something moved in his face that was not a smile, but existed in the same territory. The expression of a man who has been in the dark long enough that even the outline of a door is enough. 29 days, he said. Thornvale arrives by morning, she said. Revith's contact gets the commission letter by afternoon. That buys us the Foss conversation. She looked at the map. The Northern Elder Council convenes in 12 days. If we have their alignment before the Assembly, we need the Eastern Council too. Elder Myrith. I've treated her granddaughter for 6 weeks. Does she know what I am? She will in 12 days. Seris looked at him steadily. She needs to see what Ember House is before that meeting. Not a temporary settlement, not a political gesture. The real thing. She needs to see both of us operating, Vaelor said quietly. She didn't confirm it out loud. She didn't need to. Outside, Hollowmere was beginning its gray pre-dawn preparation. The Eastern Settlement's mill started its morning rotation. The river moved dark and steady. Somewhere, a child was already arguing about something with the full-throated certainty of someone who had not yet learned to moderate their convictions. Thomas appeared at the common house door, took a piece of bread from the basket on the bar without asking, looked at the maps, looked at both adults, looked at the lawyer's notes spread across the second table. You're planning something, he said. Yes, Seris said. He looked at Vaelor. Is he helping? Yes. Tomas considered this with the grave, unsentimental evaluation of a 14-year-old for whom practical competence was the only valid currency. Good, he said. Ember House needs more than one competent adult. He ate the rest of the bread. The mine foreman wants to know when you're coming back for the Halveth Pass consult, he said to Vaelor. Said you were in the middle of something. Vaelor looked at him. Then he looked at Seris. And in 29 days, the Succession Assembly would convene and the Corvain Coalition would arrive with its 4 votes and its commission letters and the full momentum of a strategy that had been running for months. And what happened next would be determined not by who had the most power, but by who had done the work. And for the first time in the entire length of this story, those two things pointed in the same direction. The 29 days did not pass cleanly. Nothing worth building ever does. The first week was the hardest in the way that first weeks always are when the work is real. Not because the obstacles were greatest at the beginning, but because the people doing the work had not yet established the rhythms that make sustained effort possible. They were still learning the specific grammar of how to operate alongside each other. And that grammar, like all grammars, could only be acquired through use. Vaelor worked the water channel dispute to resolution in 4 days. He did it the way he had always done governance work, methodically, with an attention to precedent and a refusal to accept easy answers that papered over structural problems rather than resolving them. The Eastern Settlement foreman watched him work and said nothing for 3 days, and on the 4th day said to Seris in the direct manner of a man who does not see the point of indirect communication that whatever else was true about the former king, he understood how to make a broken system function, and that was the only qualification that mattered in this territory. Seris treated 41 patients in the first week. She documented all of them. She wrote to the Northern Provincial Health Registry with the systemic findings on lung condition in the mining population, which was the letter she had been building the evidence base for since her first week at Ember House, and which carried the specific, unignorable weight of 6 weeks of precise clinical documentation behind it. The registry responded in 8 days. They had not responded to anything from a Hollowmere practitioner in 3 years. Thornvale managed the Foss situation with the quiet, surgical precision that had made him the most feared legal strategist in the Empire's court circuit for 2 decades. He did not threaten. He did not make explicit demands. He simply arranged a private meeting with Aldrin Foss in the capital and laid the two pieces of information, Vaelor's knowledge of the debt structure and Seris's documentation of the medical contract irregularities, on the table between them with the same unhurried calm he brought to every tribunal he had ever entered.
Foss changed his vote on the 14th day.
He cited personal conscience in the formal council record. Thornvale read this and said, in a message to Seris that was otherwise entirely procedural, that he had been doing this work for 40 years, and personal conscience remained his favorite explanation for the sudden discovery of better judgment. The council split was now 4-4, Krall held. On the 17th day, a letter arrived at Ember House from Elira Draven's physician at Mirewatch. The letter said that the Dowager Queen had stabilized in the last 2 weeks, and attributed this, in the specific language of a physician describing something he did not entirely have a clinical framework for, to a reduction in what he called accumulated burden. He said she was sleeping better. He said she had started working in her correspondence again. Seris read this letter twice and then set it with the other document she was keeping in the carved cedar box she had brought from her mother's estate 17 years ago. The box that held the things she did not keep for evidence or record, but for weight. For the personal accounting of what had happened and what it had cost, and what it had ultimately been worth. She did not show the letter to Vaelor immediately. She showed it to him that evening, when the last patient had left, and the fire was at its working level, and he was at the east window with the legal archive of the succession statutes, which he had been working through with the focused, almost aggressive attention of a man who has located the specific problem that matches his specific capability. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. "She went to you before the tribunal," he said. "Yes." "She didn't tell me she was ill." "No." He set the letter down on the table with the particular care of someone handling something that carries more weight than its physical form suggests. "She's been managing it alone." "She's been managing most things alone for a long time," Seris said. "That was the point of what she told me." He looked at her. Not with the specific contained expression of Ashthorn Palace, with something that had no armor in it. "What did she tell you?" Seris told him. She told him the version she had told Thornvale at the way station, not edited for strategy, not managed for effect. The accurate version. Elira's 40 years of precise, unsentimental testimony about what it had looked like inside the structure that had made Vaelor who he was. He listened the way he had been learning to listen in the weeks since Hollowmere, not waiting for the pause in which to respond, not processing for implication and counterargument, but actually receiving what was being said, which is a different and harder skill than it appears from the outside. When she finished, he was still for a long time. "I thought she had chosen it," he said. I watched her every day for 20 years, and I thought what I was watching was someone who had decided this was acceptable." "I know. I didn't understand that a person could be that intelligent and still have no viable alternative." "Most people don't," Seris said. "Understanding that intelligence doesn't equal freedom of movement is something you can only learn from the inside." He looked at the fire. "I made the same assumption about you." "Yes. I saw your capability and I decided it meant you were content. That if you weren't content, you would have done something about it." He paused. "I didn't consider that you were doing something about it every day. That accommodation at that scale is its own form of exhausting, constant work." She looked at him in the firelight with the direct, unsparing attention that had always been the most fundamental thing about her. "What do you want me to say?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm not asking you to say anything. I'm saying it because it's true. And because—" He stopped briefly. "Because the record between us has too many things unsaid already, and I'm done contributing to that. This is the specific courage that comes after all the easier forms of courage have been used up. The courage of the corridor, the resignation, the coming north without ceremony. These were large gestures, visible and definitive, the kind of acts that can be pointed to as evidence of transformation. But they were also, in their way, clean. They had the clarity of decisions made in extremity. What takes more sustained courage is the daily, undramatic practice of saying what is true in ordinary moments. Not in crises. Not when the corridor is on fire and the choice is between action and failure. In quiet rooms by evening fires, when the easier option is silence, and the costlier option is the specific vulnerability of speaking a truth no one has demanded from you. Vaelor had spent 20 years being very good at the crisis version. He was learning the quiet version. It was harder. On the 23rd day, Elder Myreth arrived at Ember House. She came without announcement, which was consistent with everything Seris had learned about the Northern Elder Councils over 6 weeks of treating the population they governed. They did not perform their authority, because in this territory, authority had always been earned through presence and lost through absence, and the people who held it understood this in the bone-deep way of inheritance. She was 71, with the specific unhurried physical quality of someone who has been cold for most of their life and has stopped arguing with it. She stood in the Ember House doorway and looked at the space with the careful, comprehensive attention of someone conducting an assessment. Her granddaughter Lyra was sitting at the preparation table helping Seris sort the dried herb inventory, a task she had appointed herself to 3 weeks ago with the sovereign certainty of a 9-year-old who has decided she belongs somewhere. Elder Myreth looked at Lyra, then at Seris, then at Vaelor, who was at the east window with the legal archives. "I heard there was a former king working on the water channel dispute," she said. "He resolved it," Seris said, 4 days ago. "I heard that too." The elder came inside, moving through the space with the measuring attention of someone reading a room's character from its organization. "I also heard what happened at the Eastern Settlement Common House." She looked at Vaelor directly. "You stepped in front of the blade." "Yes," he said. "For her." "Yes." Elder Myreth looked at Seris. "Is he staying?" And this was the question, asked without ceremony, without the political architecture of the succession assembly, or the legal framework of the covenant statutes, or any of the formal apparatus that had been built around this question in every other context where it had been approached. Asked by a 71-year-old woman in a healing sanctuary, directly, in the manner of someone who has learned that direct questions get the only kind of answers worth having. Seris looked at Vaelor. He was watching her. Not with the expectancy of a man who needs confirmation, not with the careful management of someone building toward a desired outcome. With the patient, open attention of a man who has learned, at considerable cost, that some things cannot be anticipated, and that the correct response to that is not to preempt, but to wait. "Yes," Seris said. It was one word. It was not negotiated, not qualified, not surrounded by the careful architecture of conditions, just the plain, direct answer to a plain, direct question. Elder Myreth nodded once. "Then the Northern Council will consider the question of succession alignment on its merits." She paused. "The Eastern Council will want to see the medical registry correspondence." "I'll have copies prepared," Seris said. "Good." The elder looked at Lyra. "Come, child. Let the adults work." Lyra looked at Seris with the specific expression of a 9-year-old who is torn between obedience and the conviction that she is currently located at the center of something important. Seris gave her a slight nod. She went. The succession assembly convened on the 29th day in the citadel of Morningstone. The chamber was the same chamber, cold marble, silver banners. The gallery, full with the specific quality of an audience that understands it, is watching something that will be referenced for a long time. But the configuration of the people in it was different from the tribunal 6 weeks before. The 7 provincial elder representatives sat in the front gallery, which was protocol for succession assemblies. The elders' alignment was a matter of public record and was recorded at the start of proceedings before any council vote occurred. This sequence had been established to prevent the council from making decisions that appeared to preempt the provincial mandate. Corvain's advocate understood this perfectly well and had spent 29 days attempting to work around it. He had not managed it. When Chief Arbiter Corvus called the assembly to order and asked the elder representatives to formally record their provincial alignments, the 4 coalition-aligned councils declared for Aldrich Corvain's candidacy in the order that had been expected for weeks. The Northern Council, through Elder Myreth's formal representative, declared for the interim authority block. The Eastern Council followed. The Upper Territories Council, whose elder representative had said nothing publicly for the full 29 days and whose silence had been interpreted by every interested party as impenetrable, looked at the record of the previous 6 declarations for a long moment before speaking. He said, "The Upper Territories Council has reviewed the documented record of governance and community service in the Hollowmere territory over the past 6 weeks. We align with the interim authority. The chamber went very still. 5-4. Aldrich Corvain's candidacy did not have the votes. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that the corridor had been dramatic, or the tribunal, or the commission letter on the Common House table. It was the specific quiet drama of arithmetic, of a number that was sufficient and a number that was not, and the understanding that the difference between them had been made by water channels and medical registries and documented case notes, and two people sitting at a table in a frontier common house working the same problem from the two different angles that their lives had given them access to. Krall called the vote. The Corvain candidacy failed. The succession assembly would proceed to a formal convening of the full imperial electoral body, which meant a period of structured interim governance that kept the council intact, which meant that the coalition had not lost the war, but had lost the specific battle that mattered most in this specific month, which meant that the territory of Hollowmere and its inhabitants and its medical registry correspondence and its water channel allocation model would exist, for at least the foreseeable future, in a political context where those things were possible rather than systematically dismantled. This was not everything. It was enough. Vaelor was not in the citadel of Morningstone when the vote was called. He was at Ember House. Seris had left the assembly proceedings to Thornvale, whose presence there served the function her presence could not: the visible, credentialed advocacy of someone whose professional reputation was itself a form of argument. Her presence in the chamber would have shifted the assembly's focus from the governance record to the personal history, and the governance record was what needed to be in the room. So she was at Ember House when the rider arrived with Thornvale's message. Vaelor was across the room, at the east window, not pretending to work. He had been not pretending to work for 3 hours, which was the specific quality of a man who has done everything within his capacity to affect an outcome and is now in the difficult country of waiting. She read the message. She looked at him. He read her face before she spoke. Something happened in his expression that was not relief. Relief is what you feel when a threat is removed. What crossed his face was more complicated and more human than relief. It was the specific, briefly unguarded expression of someone who has lived inside uncertainty for so long that the moment of resolution feels almost physically disorienting, as though the ground you had calibrated your footing to has shifted under you by becoming more stable. She set the message on the table. She said, "It held." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Thornvale, he'll be back by evening." Another quiet moment. The fire held its level. Outside, the Hollowmere River moved through its winter register, dark and continuous, and indifferent to the things that human beings constructed on its banks. "What now?" Vaelor said. She looked at him. "Now we find out what the electoral body decides about the succession." "That's not what I meant." She knew that was not what he meant. She had known, in those weeks since the Common House corridor, that this conversation was building toward them the way weather builds. Not suddenly, but with the slow accumulating inevitability of pressure that has been gathering long enough that the only question remaining is when it arrives, not whether. She said, "I don't have a clean answer for you." "I know. What happened in the last month has been—" She paused, looking for the word that was accurate rather than kind or unkind. "Necessary. The work has been necessary. What you've become in the doing of it has been—" She paused again. "Real. I have watched you become real in this place, and that matters to me in a way I am not going to pretend it doesn't." He waited. "But I need you to understand something about what I've built here." She looked at the room around them, not with pride, not with the proprietary satisfaction of ownership, but with the specific, earned regard of someone looking at the evidence of their own genuine labor. "This is mine, not in the legal sense, in the sense that it came from me, from my knowledge and my decisions and the work of my hands, and I did it without permission and without support and without any structure that I hadn't built myself. And I will not fold it into something that requires me to be the secondary thing again." "I know that," he said. "I need you to know it specifically, not in the abstract. I need you to know that if you stay here, what you stay in is my house, my practice, my community. You are a person who is useful here, and who I have—" She stopped. Then, with the honesty she had committed to in the tribunal chamber and had not rescinded since, "who I have not stopped loving, But the usefulness and the love both exist inside a structure that I built, and that I am not going to rebuild around someone else's requirements again. He looked at her for a long moment. This is what true accountability costs in the end. Not the large gesture in the crisis moment, not the resignation of a throne, dramatic and irrevocable, the daily ongoing cost of subordinating the instinct toward authority that 20 years of being deferred to had built into his body as thoroughly as breathing, and doing it not once but continuously, in small ordinary moments. In the habit of how he moved through a space that belonged to someone else, and the way he asked rather than assumed, and the quality of attention he brought to learning the rhythms of a life he had not built. The real measure of who he was now was not what he had done in the corridor. It was what he would do with a question like this one, on an ordinary evening, with no audience and no crisis and nothing at stake except the truth. "Your house," he said. "Your terms." She looked at him. "I came here because I wanted to be someone capable of deserving to be here," he said. "Not to negotiate territory, not to reestablish anything I lost." He held her gaze with the open, unarmored directness that she had first seen in his face outside the citadel, and had watched deepen in the weeks since into something that felt less like a revelation and more like a recovery, as though this was the person who had always been underneath the 20 years of accumulated sovereignty, waiting to be excavated. "If I stay because you want me here. Not because I've made myself indispensable. Not because the political situation created a reason, because you have decided that what I am now is something worth having in the life you've built." The fire in the ember house spoke its low, continuous truth. She crossed the room. She did not cross it quickly, the way you cross a room when urgency is operating. She crossed it with the same deliberate, unsparing attention that characterized every significant thing she did, fully present to each step, not managing toward an outcome, but moving toward what was actually true. She stopped in front of him. She said, "I have decided that." Not as concession, not as the culmination of a negotiation, as the plain, direct statement of a woman who had spent 6 weeks watching someone become real in difficult conditions and had reached a conclusion that the evidence supported. He touched her face with the specific, careful quality of a man who understands that what he is touching is not something he possesses and has never been, but something he is in the extraordinary, undeserved presence of, and who has finally learned the difference between those two conditions well enough to feel it in his hands. She let him. Outside, Hollowmere moved through its winter evening with the steady, self-sufficient continuity of a community that had been surviving in difficult conditions long before either of them arrived and would continue long after. The mill ran. The river ran. Somewhere in the settlement, a door opened and closed, and voices carried through the cold air with the comfortable, ordinary music of people ending their day. Tomas knocked an hour later. He opened the door before they answered, which was his consistent practice and which Seris had stopped attempting to modify. He looked at them both with the frank, evaluative gaze of a 14-year-old taking stock of a situation. "Thornvale's horse is at the South Road," he said. "He's coming up." "Tell him to come in when he arrives," Seris said. Tomas looked at Vaelor. "Are you staying the permanent kind of staying?" It was the exact quality of question that a child asks without understanding that they are asking something enormous. Direct, unqualified, interested only in the factual answer. Vaelor looked at Seris. She was already looking at him. "Yes," he said. Tomas accepted this with a single nod, the nod of someone receiving information that confirms what they had already determined was the correct outcome. "Good," he said. "The water channel model has a variance problem in the spring runoff calculation. Aldrich says he needs you to look at it before the thaw." He left. Thornvale arrived 20 minutes later with the formal assembly record and the cold of the road on his coat, and the expression of a man who has done exceptional work over a sustained period and is permitting himself, in this specific moment, a fraction of satisfaction about it. He looked at the two of them. He looked at the fire. He looked at the cedar box on the preparation table, the carved one, the one Seris had brought from her mother's estate, which he recognized from the way station room because he noticed things like the objects people kept close to them. He said, "It held." "We know," Seris said. "Sit down. There's tea." He sat. He accepted the tea. He opened the assembly record on the table and began his account of the proceedings
with the methodical precision of a man who understood that good outcomes needed to be documented as carefully as crises, because documentation was how outcomes became durable. And the evening continued the way evenings in working places continue. Not with ceremony, not with the dramatic punctuation of a story resolving itself, but with the quiet, irregular rhythms of people who have work to do and a fire to do it beside, and enough trust in the room to leave the important things unspoken now that they have finally, at considerable cost, been spoken. Much later, after Thornvale had gone and the documents were in their order and the last of the evening's preparations were complete, Seris stood at the north-facing window and looked out at the frozen marshland under winter stars. She was aware of the scar where her old bond mark sat, the bond that had been made in ceremony and unmade in a corridor at midnight, and remade in something that had no ceremony in it at all, only the accumulated evidence of days. Vaelor came to stand beside her, not behind her, beside her, looking at the same dark. She thought about what Illyra had told her in a way station room, that the grief was the record, that the love and the damage were both true, that truth spoken into official record had a permanence that private understanding did not. She thought about the tribunal chamber and what it had felt like to stand in it, and let the full weight of what was true occupy the room without managing it into something safer. She thought about what it had cost to build this place, not the physical labor which had been real and significant, but the deeper cost of choosing to be the full version of herself in it, without the accommodation that the palace had required, without the narrowing that love had once demanded. She had paid that cost. She was still paying it in the daily ordinary work of being someone who did not shrink to fit the available space, but insisted on the space fitting her. And standing at this window, with the frozen marshland before her, and the fire behind her, and a man beside her who had finally, after the longest possible route, arrived at the understanding that love is not a territory you hold, but a condition you earn continuously through the quality of your attention. She understood something that the story had been building toward from its first moment. Dominance builds kingdoms. But the rarest and most difficult power is not the power to compel. It is the power to remain present to what is actually true when the truth is uncomfortable, and to let that truth change you in the ways it requires. And to do this not once in a crisis, but every day in the ordinary work of being alive alongside another person. Vaelor had been a king. He was learning to be something harder, a man who stayed, not because the empire required it, not because the political situation made it useful, not because the performance of staying served any purpose except the plain, daily, unglamorous fact of having decided that this specific life, in this specific place, beside this specific person, was the one worth being present for. Outside, Hollowmere held its winter dark. Inside, the fire held its level. And the river moved on in the dark below the window, running its cold, continuous course toward spring, the way rivers do, without waiting for permission, without requiring anyone's acknowledgement, simply doing the thing it was made to do with the full, unhurried force of its nature, as it had always done, as it would do long after the empires and the crowns, and the succession assemblies and the commission letters had been folded into the archive of things that mattered once and then became history. The river ran, the fire held, and in a quiet house at the edge of the known world, two people stood at a window and looked at the dark together. And the dark did not require anything from them except their presence in it, which was, after everything, exactly enough.